Can everyone hear me?
Pretty good. Yeah, can hear you.
Awesome. Absolutely fantastic. Actually, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. We've got a pretty small class today, which is fantastic for literature. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what we're doing, and then we'll run through. So essentially, my name's Josh, and I'll be taking literature today. We are going to run through both section A and section B, and I've got a few examples and just activities and stuff based on certain texts. Now, the issue with literature is that there are so many different texts that are covered. So I apologize if we, for example, just practicing an activity or practicing some skills that we've gone over today on a text that you don't know. Now, at the end, there's lots of different examples of text we can use. But essentially today, worry less about the examples I'm using and worry more about the skills and that sort of stuff. So we're just going to wait a couple more minutes just for everyone to file in, and then we'll get started. I don't think your audio is connected, Maddie. Yeah, awesome.
Hey, sorry. Took me like 500 years to connect to audio.
That's all right. How are you going?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, excited. Very excited.
Very good. What's going on, Josh?
Nothing much. I was just saying to everyone here that we are quite fortunate that it's just a small group. And essentially we're just going to be running over, our basic tips and tricks, and then how to tackle each section of the exam.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome.
How many people are in the class?
I believe it should be around 25, but we'll get started. I reckon we can get started and just do a brief introduction. As people file in, they can join in. That's
okay, cool.
All right. Awesome. Okay, so I'm just going to share. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so essentially today, this is a Skyline exam revision series in partnership with UBS. Today's English literature, and we'll be going till 1 p.m. Awesome. Okay, so just a bit of etiquette for today. Essentially, we've obviously got a smaller class, so there's less strict here, but it's great for you to have your video on, but if you don't want to, that's all fine. Use the chat button use the chat function to ask any questions, and we'll be checking on that throughout the session. And we'll also have at the end of each section a bit of Q&A and a bit more interactivity. Otherwise, feel free to ask at any time, and just try to stay on mute throughout. So today I've got a rough overview, and depending on how we're feeling, we may spend more time in some areas and less time in others. But essentially, we're going to focus for about an hour on what literary perspectives and literary criticism is, and then section A of the exam. We're going to do a bit of a Q&A thing. We'll have a short break in between section A and before we go into section B and language analysis and that sort of stuff. And another short break and Q&A before we finally jump for the last half an hour of today into tips, tricks, and how to study, especially focusing on how to plan and how to tackle the exam, because it can be a pretty scary thing. All right, so before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're all gathered on today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, for they hold the memories, traditions, the culture, and the hopes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation. Okay, so I thought I'd just give you a bit of an overview of who am I. So I've got a funny picture of me there, but I graduated from a school called Gippsland Grammar in 2018. Gippsland Grammar is a school in rural Victoria, so about 3 hours away from Melbourne. So I can definitely relate to the idea of not having many resources. And fortunately for me, I was very passionate about literature, and I tried to engage with as many resources as I could, which is why I felt quite confident at the end of the year. So I achieved an ATAR of 99.85 with a raw 48 in literature. And so literature was easily one of my favorite subjects and something I'm still to this day really passionate about. Having said that, I'm not actually doing that much literature in uni for study-wise. I'm studying my Doctor of Medicine and Bachelor of Medical Science this year. I'm in my second year at Monash University. And that picture there is from an eating challenge I did on Facebook Live at the start of lockdown. You can see my haircut is very different to what it is now. Awesome. Okay, so Maddie, would you like to just give us a quick introduction overview as to who you are?
Yeah, sure thing. Hi guys, so I'm Maddie and I work at UBS, but like first and foremost in my eyes, I'm a uni student. I'm studying a Bachelor of Science. I'm in my third year, but I'm actually majoring in statistics within the science school, but also English literature within the arts faculty at Sydney Uni. And I graduated from high school in Sydney in 2017. So not too long ago. And I'm very keen to be helping out today.
Awesome. Absolutely fantastic. So just to begin, I thought we'd just run over a few things related to the changes to study design this year. Now, literature is very fortunate in the fact that, you know, we don't have all this content we have to memorize and all these types of questions we've got to do. It's simple enough that with that in the exam, we're writing 2 essays. So the exam maintains 50% of your study score, but for the SACs you've done for Unit 3, so that's your transformations SAC, where you're looking at the difference between, say, a movie and its original play, as well as those sort of SACs, that is now being boosted. Instead of a quarter, it's now 30% of your study score. And Unit 4, which is your literary perspectives and your close analysis SACs, which is what the exam is comprised of, is now 20% of your study score. So if at all you're feeling stressed about, you know, this semester, these past few months and the upcoming months, don't stress as much, because like VCAR understands this is a very stressful time and it's no longer worth as much of your study score. So again, while Unit 4 counts for no longer counts for as much, the exam is entirely on Unit 4 skills. That being said, you in the exam, you don't have to use text that you necessarily studied in Unit 4. Personally, I used the text that I did like in class, but you could definitely be using, if you're more comfortable with the text that you did, say, at the start of the year, there's no reason why you can't use those in the exam at the end of the year. All right, so essentially, we're just going to run through a bit of exam structure to begin with. For those of you who aren't familiar, so the exam is scored out of 40 marks, 20 marks for each section. So section A is essentially an essay using a prompt about your text, and you're analyzing your text through the lens of a perspective. So I don't know if you've ever seen a literature exam, but they're actually quite thick because they have to contain a simple sentence, a simple discussion that we'll go over a bit later today, but a simple prompt from every single of like the 40 texts that VC literature has to offer. And so you go through and you choose your prompt, and then you can start writing. Section B is a bit different. It's close analysis of the 3 given passages to form a substantiated interpretation of the text. So essentially, they'll also give you, in the second half of the booklet, from each text, there's going to be 3 long passages. And again, you pick your text, so whatever one you studied, and you analyze these 3 passages to create an informed interpretation of the text. Like you write an essay about your analysis of these 3 passages. The things to note here is that, for one, you can't use the same text in section A and section B. And more than that, you can't actually use the same type of text. So let's say in school you studied 2 types of poetry. You actually can't do the first poet in section A and the second poet in section B. So you have to do, like, say, a play in section A and poetry in section B, for example. They just have to be of different types. So if you're going to be doing, say, a short novel in section A, then you can't do a short novel in section B. The other thing to note is that your exam gets marked by 2 different markers. So while it's a total score out of 40 for your exam, you actually technically scored out of 80. So 2 markers you'll read, each marker will read your essays. So there'll be 2 markers to read your section A essay and 2 markers to read your section B essay. And most of the time they'll give you the same score because they're all very familiar with the way it's being marked. And if there's ever a discrepancy in scores, let's say one marker gives you a 15 out of 20, another gives you a 17, then it goes to a third marker who will decide which marker of the original markers is more accurate. So that was something I was very stressed about in high school, that these markers wouldn't, like, I'd have one marker who didn't know what I was talking about, but rest assured, they have like safeguards in place to make sure that you get the mark that you deserve. The other thing to note is that this exam is unlike the other English exams, rather, because it's only 2 hours long. So you have 2 hours, 15 minutes to start your reading time, and only 2 hours to write these 2 essays. All right, so I'm just going to stop sharing just for a second. We have a program that we're going to be using today called Mentimeter. I'm just going to get that up. I'll share my screen again. Okay, so essentially, this program here, which just allows you to put in questions and answers, and that's just what we're going to be using for today. So essentially, you can just go to www.menti.com and use this code 893562 for today, and it will go through. And essentially, just wondering what text you're studying. So feel free to put the text that you're planning to do for the exam, and pop them into the program up there, and it should come up on the screen. Oh, absolutely fantastic. So there's quite a few good ones here. So Emily Dickinson is an absolutely fantastic poet. Her poetry is absolutely amazing, as is Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath is personally a favorite of mine. I didn't study her in high school, but I did a bit of, I do enjoy reading her poetry because it's absolutely fantastic. We're going to cover a bit of that today, actually.
I'm pretty sure I did Plath in year 11, not for year 12, but I definitely did it. So
yeah,
good.
Fantastic.
You guys will have fun.
I also see Cat and the Hot Tin Roof here. So Cat and the Hot Tin Roof I did in year 12. So I've got a couple, and it's still in the study design. So there's a couple of examples of Cat and the Hot Tin Roof. And Cat and the Hot Tin Roof, for those who don't know, is a play about a family in the American South that we'll go into a bit of detail a bit later, but just for example's sake. And it's a super easy one to get involved with perspectives, which is what we're going to use it. We're going to use it a bit today to cover. Personally, I studied for the exam. I studied this set of poetry by Robert Browning, which is no longer in the study design, but it's absolutely fantastic. I would definitely recommend reading if you like poetry. And I also studied a play called Buried Child, which is a very, very creepy play. And that is on the study design, but not many schools do it. I've used it a couple of times as examples of how I would write. But that's all we need to know. Okay, awesome, absolutely fantastic. Thank you everyone for sharing your text there. We're just going to keep going through our slides now. All right. Okay, fantastic. So today, to begin with, we're going to start off with literary perspectives. So I'm going to go from a very basic overview into something a little more complicated. So I've just got this meme here because I really resonated with this meme at like the when I first started English, because I was like, oh, the curtains are blue. That doesn't mean anything. Like, a teacher can't just say that means they're sad or whatever. But towards the end of literature, I kind of understood like where these teachers were coming from. So essentially, I studied a range of different perspectives in year 12, from like feminism to Marxism, all the way to postmodernism, which was pretty cool. And through these lenses, I kind of started to understand what everything would mean. And this idea of, the curtains are blue, symbolizing sadness, even if an author didn't necessarily intend for it. So essentially, just to give you a very brief overview, historically, like in philosophy, there have been these ideas of hundreds of years ago, this idea of truth and what is a truth? Because there are types of truths that we know for a fact are true. For example, the saying that all bachelors are unmarried men is a truth because by definition, a bachelor is an unmarried man. But there are other sorts of truths that rely entirely on our own interpretation. And this is where the study of semiotics comes in. And this is more of the idea that symbols can mean different things. For example, if any of us are walking down the street and see a giant yellow M, we are all pretty clued on to the idea that that means McDonald's. And it's representative of fast food, but yet you go back to any other point in time and that's not the case. This symbol is very subjective for today and our environment in the world today. But that obviously that truth that we can see that symbol to represent isn't necessarily the truth for everyone ever. And this very much ties into the idea that was discussed in the 20th century by this guy called Roland Barthes, who was a postmodern scholar, and he had this idea called death of the author. And essentially, very simply, it's this idea that once the author has finished their text and you are reading it, they're no longer part of the text. Any meaning that they prescribe to the text isn't necessarily true for you. For example, in this room, we all could be reading the same novel, and we all could form substantially different interpretations of that same novel. We all could say it means different things, and even we could all think it means completely opposite things. And that doesn't mean any of us are lying or any of us are wrong. It's just that truth is subjective for us. I think the classical example there is a text called Heart of Darkness, which is about the colonization of the Congo and parts of Africa. And there are many interpretations of this text. And some people would say, and this text is horrific. Like it talks a lot about the brutality that some people faced. And for a post-colonial historian, or they might look at the text and say this horrific violence is representative of an idea of racial superiority in Europeans, which is to be condemned because it's caused such terrible things. But at the same time, a Marxist historian might say, well, the drive of Europeans, of these European countries for this greedy desire to obtain more capital led them to go to Africa to exploit the land and commit horrific acts. So both of these interpretations have come from the same point, but have led to quite different ideas. And neither of those are wrong. They're both true in their own way, because interpretation is entirely reliant on your own experience. And that's essentially what I want to try to get across to you today. So just because an author didn't mean to put something in, or just because someone who disagrees with your interpretation, doesn't mean it's wrong. All right, so what is a lens? So again, in life, we evaluate a text through a lens, and all of us do this. We all have our own experiences that sort of cloud our judgment or interfere with the way we view things. And most often our lens is a result of our experiences, our culture, our beliefs, our worldview, and no two people are going to interpret the same passage, let alone the same novel, in the same way. In literature, we use a lens as a basis to analyze the text. So I'm going to take you through two big ones, and then a third one, which I think is a little interesting. So the feminist perspective is probably the most common one that's used in VC literature. And if you go to the VC literature exam report, which we'll cover it towards the end, you'll find that a lot of absolutely fantastic essays, very high scoring essays, use this perspective. Because especially in literature, when we're analyzing texts from hundreds of years ago or even mere decades ago, there are still serious undertones of misogyny and oppression, which is why using a feminist perspective is so applicable to almost everything we read. So the feminist literary perspective focuses essentially on how literature reinforces or undermines the oppression of women socially, economically, and politically. So the feminist perspective is very much concerned with how a text represents gender roles and the consequences of this. So the classic example here that I will say is in this text, Buried Child, that I studied. It begins with an old man on a couch in his basement, and he looks like he's dying. He's decaying. He's just watching television. The television just lights up his face, and it's a pretty horrific sight. And through this introduction sequence, the voices of his wife calls from off stage. Now, a feminist perspective can analyze this in quite a few different ways. And the one that I would always go to is the fact that even though his wife, who's upstairs and able to make herself, is allowed enough for her to be heard, she is still relegated to that position of a disembodied voice. Whilst she's healthy and she's well, she's being pushed off stage to the sidelines of the stage, while the patriarch of the family is dying, decrepit, and is essentially sitting in this chair doing nothing. He still gets the spotlight and center stage. So it's beyond, so what I'm trying to emphasize there is a feminist perspective in particular is beyond just what people say. It's definitely important to be looking out for misogyny within what's written in the text, but also what is not necessarily written as well. So there's some key questions that we like to ask here. So how does the text portray gender? How are sexual stereotypes reinforced? Are characters defined by gender norms? How do different sexes interact? Are female characters given as much as a voice as male characters? And do characteristics like strength or importance transform female characters into being quote unquote male? And how are gender roles undermined and disrupted? So, and one big issue historically with literature has been giving female characters more autonomy. It shouldn't make them more male. Being male, as we know, shouldn't be the thing to achieve. It should be being oneself. So it's beyond just, again, it's beyond just these ideas of having, like, say, who gets less of the spotlight, who gets pushed off stage. And definitely we want to be investigating those high scoring essays and those high scoring ideas, investigating these ideas of how do characters develop. And I think a classic here is, there's some classic movies. I won't go into them right now, but I've got a few examples for later. But there are some really classic examples of how this is done really well. But our key vocab here, we have a list that, again, you can look at later if you sign up for the recording. But intersectionality, so this idea that oppression spreads across multiple classes, gender policing, this idea of hegemonic masculinity and femininity, the patriarchy, empowerment, deconstruction of the social norms, phallocentric, which means like focused on males, internalized misogyny. So some female characters can present as misogynistic because these ideas, these societal pressures have forced them to become internalized, and agency, so one's own autonomy. A pretty interesting perspective that's also pretty commonly used in BC literature, which I think is very interesting, is the Marxist perspective. Now, the Marxist literary perspective is a lens used to investigate class conflict and then distinctions between different social classes in literature. So Marxism doesn't really care about the aesthetic form of literature. It doesn't think the aesthetic form of, like, when we read how nice it sounds, doesn't think it's as important as the political and social undertones that all novels will carry. And so again, that's another thing to note when it comes to lenses. Authors are also subject of their own experiences, and even if they don't mean to, there will definitely be ideas portrayed in a text, even subconsciously, that can indicate some sort of class conflict that Marxism seeks to explore. So a Marxist perspective, we want to be looking at quite a few different things. So we want to be looking at, is there or is there not a ruling class? And how do different social classes interpret the same set of events? Does the text, or how does the text reflect an economic base? This one here I think is really important, this next question, and is most applicable to almost every text that we study. But is the influence of capital, is the influence of money or profit portrayed as negative or pervasive? Who owns the means of production? So essentially, where does the money come from? And is the class divide recognizable? And again, we also have a range of vocabulary. So the means of production is, again, where are these resources made? A bourgeoisie, so the ruling class, proletariat, the working class, the superstructure, this idea of, the general narrative of the world, and commodification, dialectical materialism, and false consciousness are also other key ideas that I'd really suggest that you investigate if you're interested in doing a Marxist perspective. Finally, I think a pretty cool one that you may not have heard of, and I'm just going to throw this one out there, just so you guys have an idea of, there are more perspectives than just necessarily what you're taught at school, but this is a psychoanalytical perspective. And psychoanalytical perspective is pretty cool. It essentially argues that a literary text offers insight into an author's anxiety and neuroses, so that their subconscious beliefs, their hidden desires, what they're scared of, is essentially all displayed when someone has written something. So this perspective is used to illustrate that characters are merely projections of an author's psyche. So it's this belief that whenever we write about something or write about someone, they're always representative of someone, of us, or of someone we know. And so these ideas essentially, we want to be asking, like, what do we know about the author? Are there persistent literary tropes and ideas? What similarities exist between the protagonist and the author? How are characters praised or punished? Does the text resemble common myths and legends? And when do characters act abnormally? So this sort of stuff here is like, in a text, we could have a character that subconsciously might represent someone's family, or the author's family, the author's friends, and they may be, when something bad happens, they may be able to get out of it really quickly, or you might find the author punishes a character almost undeservedly. And then we can use that and have a look at that as a basis of our psychoanalytical perspective. And again, there's quite a lot of common vocab for us to look at, but I will just skip over this. So essentially, we're just going to give it a go at application. And this isn't, we're not trying to write an essay right now. We're just trying to have a few ideas. But essentially, we want to be looking at this paragraph from Cat on the Hot Tin Roof. So Cat on the Hot Tin Roof is a play that takes place on an old slave plantation in the Mississippi in the 1950s. So I just want you guys to read, and this obviously isn't how we're going to do it on the exam. We're going to focus on the exam stuff a bit later. We just want to focus on some skills now. But what I'd love for everyone to do is just have a read through this passage that I have on the screen, to spend a few minutes reading through this and think about, either using a feminist or a Marxist perspective, what parts of this passage could we use when we're thinking about a feminist lens or a Marxist lens? So where are female characters given less opportunities in this, or what are some parts of this passage here indicative? Are there any parts of this passage indicative of, say, inequality? Or for a Marxist perspective, where is the influence of capital? Is there a class divide? And all those sort of ideas. I understand if you guys haven't, if you haven't done this text, don't stress. We just want to be practicing some ideas and how we're looking at exam and how we're finding evidence for our ideas. So just give everyone a couple of minutes to go through and either pick a few examples for feminist and what ideas could support a feminist perspective, and a few ideas for a Marxist perspective. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to speak up now. Awesome. So just so we're heading through, I hope you've all had a read of this passage here, but we're just going to go through it one more time, and I'll point out some ideas that I came up with for a feminist and Marxist perspective. So we start off here with our stage directions. So our brackets represent stage directions, and we can tell this is in the American South. There again in the 1950s, and so there are serious undertones of segregation here. But essentially, we have our main character, Brick, who raises his liquor glass without answering, and Maggie, Margaret, starts talking about money. And whenever we see the word money, that is a huge thing to be looking out for in perspectives, because it's pretty clear, like, that money is very powerful. Capital is very powerful in the sense of a Marxist perspective, but also in any other perspective. For example, we can use money and use capital as a way, and who has that capital, analyze that as a way to look at the disadvantages between sexes or between groups in the text. So this goes beyond just a Marxist perspective. We also see Brick doesn't reply. He just whistles softly and Maggie keeps on speaking, even though there's no reply. And it's very much a almost a soliloquy. So it's very much a monologue here. She's not replying. Sorry, Brick isn't replying. She's not having any replies, but she's still carrying on this conversation. So, with a feminist perspective, I noticed a few things. So, the man who comes into the gallery says, "Hiya, Mr. Brick. How you feeling?" Well, straight off here, only Brick is referred to by an epithet. So the servant here doesn't say anything about Maggie or Miss Margaret or anything like that. Only Brick is referred to by a title, which is obviously indicative of a perceived social divide between men and women in this area. Likewise, this idea of femininity is portrayed as solely being like all dressed, and now that Maggie is, quote, all dressed, there's nothing else for her to do. This repetition of nothing else, like, it kind of serves as a reminder of the lack of agency that the patriarchy affords to female characters in here. And again, she repeats that, "I'm dressed, all dressed, nothing else for me to do." It's almost quite like heart-wrenching, especially when her husband isn't saying anything back to her. "What am I?" Is the next thing she says. So I know when I made my mistake, what am I? Oh, my bracelets. It kind of conditions us to believe that in this time period, or rather in the society that Tennessee Williams, who's the author of this text, that he presents, suggests that a woman's sense of worth is only defined by her accessories. So what am I? She's at that introspective questioning, and then which is answered by like, "Oh, I have my bracelets," which definitely suggests that there is a sense of worth tied to accessories. So just from this passage here, we can definitely elaborate a sense of divide between, and it's a sense of divide and inequality, frankly. So feminist perspective is definitely much easier to use, but can be very, very hard to pull off. So we had a few ideas for the Marxist perspective as well. So first off, to begin with, we have, again, the same entrance, but instead of focusing on Mr. Brick here, I'm going to focus on how you're feeling. Now, you notice that Maggie the entire time speaks very eloquently. It's also almost quite poetic the way she answers her own questions, but straight away in the introduction, we have a how you're feeling. And this very simple dialect of the servant almost serves to reaffirm these class boundaries. So we can tell, so the author uses this different way of speaking to almost like draw a line in the sand between different classes. So they're suggesting that the upper class speaks well and the lower class doesn't. So it's almost tying someone's linguistic skills in with their the worth of their class and the worth of their work. And I think the other thing to note there is Brick doesn't even acknowledge. So someone of the upper class, so someone of the lower class has to speak, and the upper class doesn't even have to acknowledge them, or barely has to acknowledge them. Then Maggie next discusses, she actually discusses quite easily the pervasive influence of capital as a core ingredient to happiness. So you can be young without money, but you can't be old without it. You've got to be old with money, because to be old without is just too awful. You've got to be one or the other, even young or with money. You can't be old without it. That's the truth. So she very, very obviously is stating that capital creates happiness, that money creates happiness. And this is like almost the antithesis to what a Marxist perspective seeks to what a Marxist ideal rather seeks to embody in a society. So for a Marxist perspective, this is a very obvious indictment of the society, of the superstructure that has enforced this, because the Marxist perspective will strongly, almost always strongly reaffirm that capital should not be the same as happiness. And finally, the last thing here is, as she starts working a collection of bracelets over her hands onto her wrists, about 6 on each, as she talks. So the symbol of excessive wealth is also used here. So not only does Tennessee Williams, talk about these bracelets, make these characters talk about these bracelets, but also very, very explicitly mentions in the stage directions that the putting on of the bracelets has to be quite obvious. And this symbol of excessive wealth used to, quote unquote, complete a character. So, oh, my bracelet, so now Maggie is made whole again. It's very indicative of a class divide, but also the sort of wealth hoarding that we see by the bourgeoisie. So the upper class has all of the wealth and then uses that wealth just for materialistic purposes, whereas the lower class doesn't have anything. That's essentially how I'd use a Marxist perspective on this passage. So, does anyone have any questions about what we've gone through so far? Nothing?
Sorry, I had a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So I'm doing a new historicist perspective at my school. I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to analyze a text from a new historicist perspective. It's kind of difficult.
Yeah, definitely. New historicist. Maddie, have you had any experience with new historicist?
Actually, haven't had any experience with
Okay.
it. Sounds tricky.
No, it's definitely a very interesting one. It's to my understanding, it's got to do with the values and perspectives of the time that the text takes place rather than today. Now, what I'll suggest is that there's actually hundreds of university level essays written about all these different texts of studying BC literature through a range of perspectives. So what I really recommend that you do, and I did this in my year 12, for all of my texts, is you can actually search up on, say, Google Scholar, which is you can just access through Google. You can search up your name of your text as well as the name of your perspective. So for you, new historicist, and there will actually be loads and loads of articles of university professors and university students analyzing the text through that very perspective you're using. So there is so much information readily available, and that's another thing I want to touch on briefly as well, is that for the section A, which we're going to cover just in a second, we can also use the perspective and quotes from other historians and other scholars to definitely substantiate your essay. So there's definitely no reason, if you're not feeling comfortable with your perspective, there's no reason not to be searching online for more information. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Oh wait,
No,
could you also apply a sort of perspective to the close analysis section, or is it?
You definitely could, but I guess you don't want to make it. I think we'll cover this in a second, but just to briefly say, in case I forget, is you shouldn't be explicitly using a perspective.
Okay.
No matter how you write, though, you're always going to have a perspective, writing, when you interpret something, you're interpreting it through your own lens. So we all have our own unique perspectives on anything. And I definitely found that my views of the poetry I analysed in year 12 for section B was definitely influenced by my understanding of postmodernism, which is the perspective I used in section A. So you definitely can use it to help your ideas, but you shouldn't be explicitly using a perspective in section B.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so section A, let's go over it. Okay, here we are. Okay, so section A is pretty interesting. It's pretty cool, and this is actually brought into the study design in 2017, I believe. So before then, it was just 2 essays on close analysis. Now it's 1 essay on literary perspectives and 1 on close analysis. So it's pretty interesting, and you guys are quite lucky because they've definitely almost perfected the way they write prompts. But the first year it came out, they had really, really difficult prompts. they had prompts that you could only use one perspective with. They explicitly mentioned in the prompt, say femininity or capital or whatever. And if you'd studied, if you hadn't, let's say there was one that talked about capital in their prompt and you hadn't studied a Marxist perspective, it was much harder to do well. That was 2017 and 2018 when I graduated. In the exams, they made the perspectives so super easy. Like my perspective for my text was something like, there in this play, there is no such thing as happiness, discuss. So super easy to use. So now in 2019 and in this year, they've refined it a little to make it a little more, the prompts are a little more detailed, and we'll go over a couple in a bit, but also not so specific that you're going to struggle using a perspective that you studied. So essentially what the checklist is you need to develop an informed interpretation of a text in response to a prompt, drawing upon a perspective. Now, this can be quite hard, and it is definitely a difficult thing to do. And the classic stitch up in my high school, so we had 8 students doing literature, and our study scores range from like 12 to 48. So there was a huge span. And what really differentiated the top half from the bottom half was the fact that integrating these prompts and perspectives. So the classic stitch up is analyzing a text through a prompt, through a lens rather, and having a really good analysis, but then forgetting about the prompt and just throwing in a few words related to the prompt at the end of each paragraph. Or the other way is writing like an English mainstream style essay where you're writing about a text through a prompt and then forgetting about your perspective and just chucking a few words about like femininity or the patriarchy on at the end. You want to combine these ideas together, and we're going to run through some examples of how you do that. So again, it's more than just responding to a prompt. It's the use of a lens to inform the basis of an essay around the key features presented by the prompt. So we want to be looking at like what are the key features a prompt presents, and how does a person using the lens we want to use interpret those features that we're talking about of this text. And one of the big things requires expressive, fluent, and coherent use of language and development of ideas. And we're going to cover a bit more of that in a little bit. Okay, so these are the sort of prompts that they have. So this is the one I had in year 12. Consider the proposition that in Sam Shepard's Buried Child, no happy ending is possible for the characters. So this is like hugely applicable. We could use anything. And a lot of these are quite useful. Like for example, with Ariel, Sylvia Plath, reflect on the idea that the poems in Plath's Ariel are more complex than simply the confession of her life. So this is a bit harder, and you obviously need to understand more than just the poem. You need to understand Sylvia Plath herself to answer this prompt, but they're all, almost open enough that we can use any perspective to try and justify these. So what I would always do, and what I recommend you guys do, is what I like to call unpacking a prompt. So, for example, here, the American family in William's Cat on a Hot Tin Roof reflects a culture that demands too much of individuals. To what extent do you agree? Now, there's a lot of things this prompt is actually asking, and it'd be quite easy to almost like gloss over it. So we want to point out the key words and phrases. So does anyone have any idea about what are key things we want to be investigating in our text through this prompt is? Feel free to just type in chat. Any key words or key phrases that you want to investigate more. Culture, yeah, awesome. That's absolutely fantastic. Any others? Demands too much. American family individuals. Yeah, 100% everyone. That's absolutely fantastic. So the ones that I picked out here were the American family. We want to work out what the American family is, because for a feminist perspective, we could be talking about a very patriarchal family, but from, say, almost a new historicist, we could be talking about a more nuclear family. Culture is another huge one. Individuals. Now, who are we talking about? Are we talking about just our main characters, or the entire cast of a play, or even just the side characters? For example, a post-colonial perspective could be looking at Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, where all our side characters are African American families. Well, looking at the resemblance of power that's left over post-slavery in the American South. So there are so many different things that this prompt could be talking about, and it just depends on our perspective. And the very key thing here, in my opinion, is to what extent do you agree? And we're going to cover that in just a second. Okay, so the American family, okay, the family, the play, who it comprises of, that sort of stuff. Or is it like that family mentioned in the play, or is it the idea of family in America? So the text focuses on this very heteronormative nuclear family and how characters interact, where and then this nuclear family that's expected in America. And I think the very important thing to be doing is when you're looking at your text is doing a bit of research into the history. So for when I studied Cat on Hot Tin Roof, I did a whole lot of research into different ideas in the time. For example, it was post-World War II, and there's these ideas of this nuclear family, but also the scare of communism. It was actually very, very important in this text. And in this text, for those who haven't read it, there's a lot of motifs and undertones that our main character is actually gay, but it's never actually spoken. And one of the main reasons for this is back in the 1950s, there was this thing called the Lavender Scare, where the Americans believed that the USSR would blackmail American officials that were gay into revealing state secrets. So in this time period, the opinion about people being gay was very different to how it is today. And that's really important to be considering when looking at a text, because we can look at a text now and say, well, why wouldn't like that person just come out to his family? But back then it was viewed completely differently, even on a level of like national security. Like it was almost like people might even say like, oh, you're a communist, and like exile you for that. So having a look at how the history of your text, the surroundings of your text, is also really important. Culture, a big one here in a lot of texts we study is the American dream. And individuals, who do you use as examples? Main characters, minor characters, or all of them? The next big thing is, so for example, what you could get out of this prompt, for example, is say, the broken family of Cat on Hot Tin Roof presents reflects how the demands of the American patriarchy enforces a legacy of hegemonic masculinity and femininity. So if I was taking a feminist perspective, this sort of prompt here is what I could kind of get out of that prompt that we just saw. Or another way to do it is say, the family structure pervaded by wealth and greed presented in Cat on Hot Tin Roof reflects Americanist demands for class loyalty. Now that's the exact same prompt. I've derived that from the exact same prompt, but this is much more of a Marxist way of looking at it. So these two ideas have come from the same point, but we've defined American family, defined individuals, defined culture all differently to create two substantially different interpretations of the text. The next thing to note is that to what extent do you agree? Well, what this is saying is it's presenting a statement, it's presenting an idea, it's saying that this idea that we've presented about the family of Cat on Hot Tin Roof is true, but to what extent is it true? And there's various different types of topics. So for example, we can have something that says, discuss a proposition that, or reflect on the idea that, you need to consider whether you agree with what's being said, and also think of any exceptions. So you want to be writing an interpretation that works closely with like these key ideas, but also looking at when is this proposition true and when is it false. And that's the whole thing. We can have a very set opinion on what's proposition, is it true or false, but to do well in literature, we need to be doing more than just saying, yes, it is, no, it isn't. We need to be looking at why. What's the evidence? Because there's always going to be evidence for both sides. When is it true and when is it not true? And then what is it overwhelmingly? Another sort of topic type would be consider the extent to which, or to what extent does. And this is saying that the proposition lies on a continuum. It's not entirely true or not entirely false, but we need to find out where it is and explain why. And your interpretation should include info from, again, all aspects of the text. We want to be looking at so many different parts of the text to actually say whether or not this is true, or like how true our proposition is. And finally, we could be getting asked, in what ways does, or how does a proposition present itself? So here, there's little room for disagreement. We want to focus on how techniques achieve this and use a perspective to draw inference to wider society. So you can see that even with the same general prompt, if we have these different topic types, so instead of it saying, to what extent do you agree, it might be saying like, in what ways does the text do this? You're going to be writing two dramatically different essays. So making sure you understand what the question is actually asking is so key, because you could be writing a 20 on 20 essay, but answering the question wrong means you're not going to get the marks you want. Okay, so I had a method of using a perspective in year 12, and I called this the method of 4 C's. And it's kind of silly, but I just felt like it worked quite well. So when I was using a perspective, when I was unfamiliar with a perspective, I would start off with close analysis. I would look at the text, look at the themes of the text, look at the language used, look at the stage directions, and analyze some of them, and say, where does a feminist perspective come into this? Look at these parts that represents like an inequality, or say from Marxist perspective, like a class difference, and analyze them. Actually, like look at the language and see what it does. From our close analysis, when we're writing, so we want to write a bit about our close analysis, then we're going to move on to our criticism. So how does our feminist perspective view that? How does our Marxist perspective view this distribution of wealth? From our criticism, we go into critique. We say, is there any way we can extend this position we've come up with? Any way we can clarify it? Or are there other points in the text that disagree with what we've just said? And finally, I would always conclude, and this is just a cycle I'd go through like every couple of sentences in all of my essays to make a much more substantiated interpretation, because I almost had a methodology of going about and interpreting. So conclude, I would try sum up what I just said and then link that back into the prompt. So obviously there's so many different methods to write, but I feel like this method for me personally, and again, literature is such an abstract subject and we're all going to have different ideas about what to do. This method for me meant that I was ticking off that box about perspective and also ticking off the box about the prompt. So again, close analysis, looking at these language features, looking at these ideas, going in and looking at then for criticism, looking at how our perspective views those. Critiquing adds a bit of nuance, so extending or clarifying or disputing the idea you've just come up with, and then concluding, tying that in to your prompt. And doing that again and again throughout your paragraphs means you're going to be having a pretty good checklist of, like, you're going to be checking off everything you need to do. All right, so structure. Just checking, we're going very well time-wise, which is fantastic. So, good thing about literature compared to, say, English language or English mainstream is that there is no structure, really. Like, we don't have to use any structure we've been given in VC Lit, especially for close analysis. But personally, I feel, because Section A, Literary Perspectives, is much more of a structured essay idea, where you're actually being given a prompt to answer. It's a good idea to have an intro to discuss and establish your perspective, and then have your body paragraphs, and then have your conclusion. The reason why we need an introduction is because you're being assessed on your use of a perspective. And if the assessors can't tell what perspective you're using until the last bit of your essay, you're not going to be getting those marks. There's different ways to do this. You could be stating outright that you're using a feminist perspective, but you see a lot of high scoring responses can also just bring up those key vocab that we talked about earlier, like patriarchy or internalized misogyny, and that's also pretty indicative of a feminist perspective. But essentially what I think is fantastic is bringing up, for your introduction, as an overview, establishing your perspective and how you interpret your prompt. So making sure that the examiner from the get-go knows what your opinion is and then what perspective you're using to justify that. We want to avoid in-depth analysis right at the start. We want to just let the examiner know what's up before we go into in-depth analysis, but also the examiner is also checking how well you know the text. And a really good way to show that is to include those big key events in the text, those big ideas, as well as some like maybe history about the text. And we also want to reference views and values. So views and values is a really important thing in VC literature, and this essentially is just the ideas of the time period in which the text is set or in which the text is written. So I'm just gonna briefly just give you a rundown of how I would write something personally. So for me, in my 2018 practice exam, the prompt was, Berry Child confronts the issue that for all characters, there is a conflict between truth and illusion. What view does the play present about this conflict? So I would always begin my essays with something like this. A consideration into the real and the fabricated is integral to understanding the postmodern wasteland of Sam Shepard's 1978 Berry Child. Indeed, as a postmodern condition gives voice to the dissonance and equivocality that plagues every facet of the play's existence, its deconstruction of the demise of the middle American agricultural family seeks to subvert the very fabric of reality as it exposes a grand narrative of the American dream as fallacious and unrealistic. So here, I've been using like my key phrases from my perspective. Now, we didn't cover a postmodern perspective earlier because it's pretty niche, but I used my key vocab there. But I also consistently referenced my opinion on the prompt, and the prompt being the conflict between truth and illusion. And I do talk about this dissonance and deconstruction and subverting the very fabric of reality. So although you can see, I've also haven't included any proper in-depth analysis, but right away I've let the examiner know what I think and what perspective I'm using. So next up is our body paragraphs. So the general go-to is each of your paragraphs should be centered around an aspect or a theme of the text. Don't, like, you have some fantastic ideas, don't mix them all together. Even if your paragraph is only 5 or 6 sentences long, that's fine. You don't need like that intro 3 paragraphs conclusion. You really want to make it as simple as you can for the examiner to understand. And even if, yeah, again, you've got a very small paragraph, that's okay, as long as it's discussing this one idea. We want to be engaging with in-depth analysis to substantiate your interpretation of the prompt through the lens of a perspective. And the key thing here to really boost your score is to be critiquing your own ideas. So an essay requires nuance. So discussing both sides of the argument, even if your conclusion leads you to sway a particular way, so discussing the negatives, even if you strongly believe in the positives, really demonstrates that you know the text well, and also you can engage in interpretation well. And it really makes that when you just ignore everything that counts against your conclusion, it can make your contention seem quite weak. But when you also say that, yeah, there are some points of the text where this happens in the other way, but the vast majority it's this way that I've been discussing, well, then you're letting the examiner know that you know the text well, and also that you're right. And so here we have the 19 to 20 mark range that's presented by VCAR. So your expected qualities are to be developing an informed, relevant, and plausible interpretation of the text that is complex, sophisticated, and perceptive, supported by detailed use of textual evidence. So again, detailed use of textual evidence. We want to be not just discussing ideas, but using quotes and discussing actual themes, character turning points, and ideas that are brought up by the text. All right, and finally, with your conclusion, summarize your analysis of the text. Bring it all to a close. Remind us again what you've been saying the entire time. I personally think it's a good tip, or a good trick, is making links to important parts of the text, especially the ending. If you can kind of draw the relationship of the ending of the text in with your interpretation, it kind of strengthens that connection to the text wider meaning. And also you need to strengthen your connection to the text wider meaning with the inclusion of views and values, and ensure at the end you have definitively answered the question the prompt poses. This here is a classic stitch-up for literature students where they know exactly what they're doing. They've written a fantastic essay, but halfway through they've kind of lost their train of thought and have answered something different. So in the worst case scenario, even if that happens, writing an extra sentence at the end to try bring it all back together can be so important and really save you a couple of marks. So I will just give you an example of my practice exam again. So I would always bring up, I'd always use a very similar structure. I'd always have a very similar intro and conclusion for every one of my essays, and a very different body paragraphs, obviously. But as the lights go to black at the play's finish symbolizes the end of another day for the sun to rise again and the trauma to repeat itself, Shepard's message of the inescapability of the conflict between truth and fabrication is conjured in the cyclic ending of Buried Child's iconoclastic chronology. So here we've again referenced that prompt, the conflict between truth and fabrication. So again, we're making sure the examiner knows that we know what we're talking about. We've also mentioned key ideas with our perspective. So the key themes of symbolism and this trauma repeating itself. We've referenced views and values, so iconoclastic, so critiquing society, and we've also made links to the actual text. The lights go to black at the end of the play. So we're really showing that we know what the text is doing. We know how the text is written. We know how our perspective works. We know our prompt, and we also know the society in which the play is set. So just having this checklist in your head again and again can be so useful and so important. So we were going to do a quick practice attempt, but I am a little worried time-wise. But essentially here we just have the same prompt that we've gone over today, as well as that same passage I've just given you for a bit of help. Maybe it's a bit of homework, or if you've got time at the end, we can come back to this one. But use the following passage to help inform an interpretation of the given prompt through the true perspective of your choice. So if you're looking for a bit of practice, especially if you're doing Cat on Hot Tin Roof, here's a really good prompt and a really good passage to help you use that sort of stuff. But for now, what I just want to cover is some of the exemplar responses offered by VCAR. So I'm not sure if everyone knows, but VCAR, so the VC governing body, releases the exam each year, as well as releases some of the top scoring essays from each year. And this year I've just taken an excerpt from the top scoring essays from the 2018 examination, which use that prompt that we were just talking about. So this is the introduction. I'll just give you a brief overview. So as Maggie becomes a lively cat in a hot tin roof, Williams portrays the suffocating confines of female existence within the rigid walls of this 1950s patriarchy. This is a post-war society that upholds the notion of conformity as a way of information stability. Yet in doing so, the world of the play becomes swarmed by broken facades as those enervating demands leave a character like Brick crippled and emotionally intransigent. With that said, however, the spectral presence of a, quote, tenderness which was uncommon subtly alludes to the potential for genuine love to allow the characters to usurp and survive the demanding expectations of their society. That is so powerful. And you can tell why this was one of the highest scoring essays of 2018. And if we go through straight away, they haven't mentioned a feminist perspective. Then nowhere do they say, I'm going to be using a feminist perspective. But it's so easy to tell. They're talking about female existence, talking about the patriarchy, and mentioning female characters. Straight away, we know what's being talked about. So they've set up their perspective. They've also linked to the views and values. They've mentioned the rigid walls of this 1950s post-war society, which gives us a bit of context as to why people feel certain ways, as well as this notion of conformity and information stability. They've used textual evidence to reference characters and themes. So they've actually mentioned characters and also used quotes, crippled, tenderness which was uncommon, and those sort of ideas to actually point to certain themes in the text of conformity, but of also genuine love. The suffocating confines of the female existence references the reflection of culture in the text, in that prompt that we just discussed. So again, they've also been referencing this prompt as well. So you can again see why this is such a high scoring essay. And they also discuss these ideas of individualism in terms of like emotional distance as well as genuine love. So they've not just talked about one idea that we presented in that prompt, they're talking about many. Okay, now this bit here is just the first bit of the first paragraph, and I wanted you guys to read this one because I think it's also incredibly good. So the figure of Brick appears to this is immediately after what we've just read. So the figure of Brick appears to audiences as a paragon of the all-American athlete. Yet the cool air of detachment that masks the violent and jarring flashes of lightning exposes a fragile and vulnerable pretense of detached nobility he offers. As Williams makes clear, this is a man who is society crowned with early laurel, a society seemingly cultivated around the strong heterosexual man, given how the American foot soldier emerged as a cultural icon of resilience in this era. Yet in an examination of Brick's potentially ambiguous sexuality across the play, the existence of something perhaps, quote, not normal in the words of this system of mendacity, in doing so, forcing the extinction of familial ties and rendering the characters combative. Now, again, that is such a powerful piece of writing. So this roughly emulates a 4Cs approach that we talked about. So again, we start off with this cool air of detachment that masks flashes of lightning, and we explain that. So exposes fragile and vulnerable pretense. We go into the criticism, and this is a man who his society crowned with an early laurel. So that's talking about obviously our hegemonic masculinity, goes into critiquing that. So where doesn't it happen, or is actually potentially sexually ambiguous. And they're concluding we've tied into the systems of mendacity, forcing the extension of familial ties. So you can see here, this roughly emulates a 4Cs approach. That and close analysis, criticism, critique, and conclude. So we also reference in this text, in this essay, a lot of views and values, cultural icons, the Americanisms of the paragon of the all-American athlete, and inferences of this American dream-esque era society that the play is widely regarded to critique. So this is why it's so important to be looking at the world beyond your text, because there are so many bits and bobs that you could be using. This idea of all-American athletes, this idea of hegemonic masculinity, and like the heterosexual man as a point through which you can base your analysis. Again, they've provided a lot of quotes as textual evidence. So they provide themes and quotes. So it really shows that they know what they're talking about. And the familial ties and the concept of normality ties together the idea of family and the overriding theme of disconnect. So again, they've actually done all of this, looked at all these ideas through the lens of a feminist perspective. And again, they've used a feminist perspective in a way that's not just talking about women, it's also talking about the role of a man. And they've linked that back into the prompt. So again, this is fantastically done. And if you would like to read more of this one, this is on the VCAR 2018 examination report. Okay, so we're going to take a brief break for now. It's 11:05. Actually, I do believe we've got the Maddie. I've got your UBS video, which is going to come up next. I'll show that one.
So awkward. They're like, "Oh, can you film a video?" I was like, "Okay," and I hadn't done it yet because I forgot, and then I just did it, guys. I had to do it on my phone. I'm really embarrassed.
All right. No, it's really good. It's really good. And it's just a few tips and tricks. It's awesome. It's awesome. And then we just do a quick Q&A. You guys can take. We'll come back at say 11. We'll come back at 11:15. We'll get started. So if you guys need to go take like a bathroom break, grab some water, whatever you need to do, feel free to go do that. And then anyone else wants to stay and ask a few questions about their study, university, anything like that, we'll have a Q&A set up as well.
I like
awesome.
This.
So here is our video. I said no audio. That's a bit awkward. Oh, that's all right. Okay, I need to enable share computer sound. That's all right. My apologies.
Forward to share. Hi,
Is that better?
I'm Maddie, and I'm a third-year cadet in global markets at UBS in the cash equities division. And I am a third-year student studying at the University of Sydney, double majoring in financial maths and statistics and English. At school, maths and English were my favourite subjects, so I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to continue studying them after school. And I also look forward to sharing what I've learned and my study skills with you guys at Skyline. I know Year 12 can be very tricky for many, including myself, but the main thing is to try your best, work hard, listen to your teachers, ask any questions to fill gaps in your knowledge, and you won't have any regrets. You'll just be incredibly proud with what you can prove to yourself and what you achieve.
Awesome, absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Maddie. We'll just run a quick Q&A if anyone has any questions. We're going to set this up through Mentimeter again, that program we were just using before. All right, so let me just grab this up. 1 second, sorry everybody. Okay, so fantastic. So whilst everyone just grabs a drink of water, whatever you guys are doing, you can access this this Mentimeter thing again just through that code on www.menti.com, and any questions you can pop up will come up here and everyone can see them. Also, seeing as we're in a small class, you could just like type them in chat, whatever. But this is also pretty cool, so everyone can see.
Yeah, this Menti thing is very cool. I've never seen it before.
No, nor have I. Gypsy actually got us all onto it, and I think it's going to be very useful for, say,
Oh,
like
Gypsy.
the big sessions, like English mainstream. This will be really useful for. But yeah, feel free to ask away, anybody. Any questions about like university or literature or study techniques or whatever. Go for it. Maddie, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Life after year 12 is very different. I'd say you have a lot of time, so that might be something people really enjoy. I actually started work 1 month before uni started, and that was just working full time. So I haven't actually had a really big break. Or my post year 12 experience might be different to like Josh and Gypsy's experience. But nevertheless, there's so much to learn about, especially at work. Just mixing with like different demographics, like professionals to learn from. I've really enjoyed that. But it has been challenging balancing like work and uni and still seeing my friends and hanging out with them. But it's all good. It's all good. Lots to look forward to.
Amazing. I see some other ones. Did you have a rigid study plan in high school? Oh, this is a fantastic question. Yeah, I totally get you and you feel so constricted. So in year 11, I thought I had to study as much as possible, and I organized my life like down to every like 15 minutes. And I was doing ridiculous amounts of study per night, and I kind of realized at the end of the year that I kind of wasted my year. Like I was studying for like 5-6 hours a night, and it was just like it frankly wasn't working. I wasn't actually doing that well because I was so stressed. And I think in year 12, I'd study a fair bit, and I'd try to do what I do. I'd do like every day I'd have like an hour and a half for a set subject, and I'd spend the other hour and a half just doing random questions and homework from other subjects. But I think the thing in year 12, and unfortunately for you guys, this is such a tough year, but you need time. You need that break for social events, like have a Zoom with your friends, play a video game, like hang out with your family. Definitely when it comes to study, manage what you're doing. Make sure you've got a checklist to check off so you actually stay on track, but also make sure you've got time for yourself. Maddie, do you have anything to add to that one?
Totally make time for yourself, and definitely I agree, like Zoom with your friends. I enjoyed studying with my friends. I actually had one friend who basically like did every single subject the same as me. So it was nice working together and just sharing notes. So we felt less restricted that way, and we were able to have some socialization with study too.
Fantastic. How many hours do you study a night? So I think we've gone over that a bit, but honestly, I think the stress here is don't aim for a number, aim for getting stuff done. Like have a goal in mind, because it's one thing to study for 3 hours and do a ton of stuff, and the reason why you study for 3 hours is because you've checked off all your goals. Then you've done or everything you need to do, and then you're studying meaninglessly. So I personally study for 3 hours a night in year 12, and then I study 4 days on weekends. But it's less about time and it's more about what you're getting done. Again, how much time do you spend studying? Yeah, so this is a very common question. Best way to study literature and subjects in general. Maddie, do you want to take this one?
I found that like making sure I was reading all of the texts, maybe like once or multiple times to just like gain my view of what the text was trying to express was important, because I know sometimes it might be overwhelming studying lots of text, but it is important to read them properly. And then after that, I would just kind of write my ideas down and maybe do essay plans through different perspectives. So like in the HSC in Sydney, we don't get marked on perspectives, but I think that would be a great idea to just try and put yourself in the lens of like feminists versus Marxists, etc., and just make plans about that to have lots of different ideas synthesized.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point that Maddie's made there. It's like, when it comes especially to perspective studying, don't just limit yourself to one. Like, just practice, even if you're not going to use an exam, practice as many as you can, because it really informs a good substantiated interpretation of the text. And I totally agree there. Like, reading your text is way more important than writing an essay when you don't know your text well. You could write 100 essays, but if you've only read your text once, you are not going to do as well as you could writing 10 essays having read your text twice. So it is really, really important to make sure that your understanding of the text, like your annotating, your discussion of themes, is the most important thing about literature. Essentially, it doesn't matter how nicely you write. You could be an absolute poet, but if you don't have that knowledge of the text behind you to back you up, you're not going to do as well as you necessarily could. Single best study tip. Oh, these are getting a bit tough. I think just as a study tip goes, the best one is make time for yourself. Again, like if you're drained, like throughout, like you've studied nonstop for days and days and then you're not going to do well. Actually, I have another one. Is don't have coffee after 3 because the caffeine will stay in your system until like 12 and you actually won't get a good night's sleep. So like have your last coffee at like 2 and then only have tea afterwards. That's it. That's actually, I think it's a good study tip that I still use to this day.
I think that's important too, because otherwise you'll think you need it, and then when it's time to go to bed, you'll stress that you're not going to get enough sleep.
Yeah, exactly. And there's nothing worse than sitting in bed, unable to sleep, and then your heart rate's going fast because you've had a coffee an hour ago, and then you're getting even more anxious about your exams because you can't sleep, and then your heart rate's getting even faster.
And then you're on WebMD and you're like, what's happening to me?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so limit the caffeine, I think, is a good one as well. Do I miss doing artsy stuff? Actually, I'm very similar to Maddie. Whereas Maddie, I think you said you were doing your English alongside your science degree.
Science.
Yeah. So so med is a little different, where we don't really get the option to do extra stuff, but if we want to, we can take a diploma and add it on top of everything. So what I did the start of this year, I took an extra unit, which was insane. So it's a whole extra class on top of your normal study load. But I was doing philosophy, and actually it is so nice to you're sitting there in medicine, doing all this crazy anatomy and all this physiology and stuff, and then having a nice essay to write. Well, I know it sounds super weird, but it's actually it's a nice bit of throwback to the high school days. But also when we look at real life and medicine and anything like that, is that it's science. There's not really this clear line between science and arts. For example, in med, we've got to do a lot about law, because if you're a doctor, you've got to know the laws about how you can treat a patient, and also ethics. We've done so much on ethics and the philosophy of ethics, even though we're doing a science degree, because there are ethical obligations you have to follow, no matter what sort of health practitioner you are.
I was doing this, there's a major at Sydney Uni called History and Philosophy of Science, and it falls under the science school. But I saw that at Melbourne Uni, it actually falls under the arts faculty. Which is a nice example of how there's no distinct line.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example.
Yeah, it's full essays, bioethics, ethics of cloning, etc. It's really interesting.
Absolutely fantastic. I think there's that really good point. So you can definitely miss doing artsy stuff, but there's a lot of arts in everything we do. And also, just because you're studying something doesn't mean you can't take an interest in something else outside of your time. Okay. Is it worth studying literature in uni? Well, I can't really answer this one, Maddie. This is...
I think it's worth studying literature at uni. I know some people might think differently, but for me, I think English is very different compared to what you study at uni is super different to what you study at school. It's more theoretical and more critical theory versus close analysis of texts, super up close analysis. It's more high level views and thinking of just ideas. whether they're like contemporary ideas or whether they're ideas from the past. I also think it's interesting when you're at uni, you see all of these students in your class come from different faculties, and it's really interesting to see their unique lenses that they've developed through their, like if they're in the business school versus me who's a science student. So it's really nice to discuss with them, and also like I've had very supportive lecturers and tutors too.
Fantastic. I think I might just do one more before we start moving on to our content again, but we can come back and answer any questions that we didn't answer. But keep procrastinating. Do you have any ways I can feel more on task? Oh, see, this here is the blight of every student ever. So we can all relate to you there. Maddie, do you have any tips or tricks?
I've got lots of uni assignments this week. I've had some trouble on the weekend getting on task, but I think lists are important, and you might feel like it's micromanaging, except if you can like get a calendar of your day and just like block out a couple hours, like morning, afternoon, evening to do some work, and then kind of put things in between that will make you feel motivated, whether that's like socializing or just like doing something fun, just to like have a visual view at you've got time to do everything, and then just get it done. Pick it off the list.
To add on to that, I think like I've got a huge problem when it comes to YouTube. I will always just open YouTube and then I'll go down this rabbit hole, and I'll watch one 20-minute video, and next thing I know it's 3 hours later. So how I came up and tried to stop myself from doing this is, if I found a video that I really wanted to watch, I knew that if I would watch it now, I wouldn't do any studies. So I'd say, okay, I'm going to finish before I can watch this video, before I can go on Facebook or do whatever, before I can answer this message, I have to finish, reading this chapter, or finish this quiz that I'm about to do, or finish watching this lecture. So setting goals for yourself, and you could even do it with like lollies. That's what I did during high school. Like, get the little like gummy bears, and I'm like, okay, I can have a couple of gummy bears only if I finish these like 10 questions and methods. And it's actually like really, it's a big driver. And then the more and more you do it, like the less and less you actually need rewards to keep going. Yeah. Alrighty. So we're going to come back, and if your question isn't answered, I'm very sorry. I think we've got a bit of time at the end for more questions. But just for the meantime, we'll continue going with our literature. All right. Okay. So language techniques. So now we're getting into the section B sort of area of the exam. But there's different types of language techniques, and I've kind of divided these into 3 different groups. You totally may not agree with me on these, but I just felt like there's a checklist to check off when you're writing your essays for exams, and setting up like this can be really useful. So language analysis, when we're writing our essays, should incorporate multiple tiers of meta-language to inform a substantiated interpretation of the text. So for example, if you're just talking about similes in your entire essay, you're going to do okay. Like, you're looking at language analysis, you're looking at the language, but you're going to do better if you're talking about similes and say imagery, and also like on-stage, off-stage voices, the rhythm of the poem, or the rhyme scheme. Like, there's a whole range of things to talk about. So how personally I divide language techniques and meta-language is into these 3 types. So technical language features, how the text is written. Melodic language features, how the text actually sounds, and structural language features, which is how a text is designed. So technical could be stuff like a metaphor, a simile, so how it's actually written. Melodic is, a poetry, like a rhyme scheme, phonology, where a structure would be our actual stage directions, or like where someone is on stage. And this is a classic one literature students often forget. In stage directions, they will tell us like what is going on. And one of the things they say year after year on the exam reports is that students forget they're writing about, say, for example, poetry instead of prose. And again, students will lose marks for doing a fantastic essay on the prose and the meaning of a poem, but forget about the fact that it's actually poetry. And the same thing goes with plays. It's not just someone standing there delivering a monologue, it's people interacting on stage. For example, we could be having a discussion on stage about, like, say, certain ideas, and it might be quite hard to tell what the author thinks of those ideas, or what sort of perspective, what sort of interpretation we can establish from that, unless you look at the stage directions. someone who's in center stage and has a spotlight on them is obviously the focus. It's obviously who we want to be listening to. Whereas someone who's, even no matter what they're saying, if they're relegated to a position on the wings of the stage, or even are coming as a disembodied voice off stage, well, then they're, for the audience, because that's what we're trying to cater to, is the audience of our plays, of our texts. To the audience, they're not viewed as important as the people on center stage. So I would try to use at least one example of each type in every section of analysis. In each of my paragraphs, I would try mention, a simile, a metaphor, those basic sort of things. Mention how a text actually sounds, but also mention how it's constructed, like the meter a poem is written in, or how a novel, even it goes into stuff like short stories, like how does a novel, or like the way it's written, like in first person or in third person, what sort of way does that push the audience to be viewing the text differently to say if it was presented as a play? Like, these are really important things to be thinking about. So I would like you guys just to spend a couple of minutes, just give me a example, type in chat of, say, a language technique that you've studied for anything from simile to imagery or whatever, and also give me an example of how that comes up. So I've got a couple of classic ones on the next page. But if anyone can just throw it, like, feel free to unmute yourself, and you can, or type in chat to give an example of a language feature that you studied, and an example of that. Hyperbole, yeah, that's an absolutely awesome one. Ben, is there a specific example you were thinking of in 12th Night?
Yeah, so the example I was thinking of is when Viola is describing Orsino's love is like thunderous with adorations and fertile tears, like that, to Olivia. That
Yeah.
And then like make me she was talking about like make me a willow cabin at your gate, or something like that.
Very, very expressive. I totally get you, and it really, really demonstrates like almost the power and the magnitude of these like abstract nouns, like love. Absolutely.
Yeah, like super exaggerated.
Awesome. Okay, so I've got a few techniques in the next slides, just a bit of a warm up for section B. Here is from one of Emily Dickinson's poems. So, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Feel free to type in chat what sort of language technique can you see in this sort of quote here. Also, this is a fantastic poem. I'd really encourage anyone to read Emily Dickinson if you haven't. Personification, awesome. There's two we caught in this one. Assonance and consonance, yeah, fantastic. All right, so the first thing I saw was enjambment, which is a type of almost like structural technique where in poetry, where we don't finish our sentence when the line ends. We continue the sentence over. And this continuation of a poem over lines really conflays this flow and rhythm. It's not jagged, it's not like cut off suddenly. Even though our line ends, our poem continues. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Other big one there is this metaphor and personification of death. Death is an abstract noun. We don't know we don't really have any way of envisioning it, but yet when it's capitalized, capital D, death, and it's personified as a he, it's this transformation of this foreign concept, this very scary concept, to something much more recognizable. And in this comparison of death as a gentleman, later in the poem, to my belief, it makes death seem, this abstract noun, seem much less scary. So sometimes metaphors and personification can be used to make something foreign seem much more, much more welcome. Fantastic. Okay, here's one from The Great Gatsby. This is a classic book. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths along the whispering and the champagne and the stars. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Anyone have any idea what this could be? Simile and imagery, yeah, fantastic. These are two fantastic ones. So straight away, the simile there is this very reductionist comparison So we have men and girls, like people, being reduced in a simile to moths, this very reductionist comparison. And it sort of bestows this like fecal nature and this flickering attention of moths, this imagery that someone pointed out there in the chat. Imagery of moths is, just buzzing around looking for light, then like no intelligence whatsoever. And it bestows those ideas onto the party guests. So again, so when we're looking at, say, something like a simile, when we're doing this analysis, we're not just saying what the simile does. Like we're not just saying that the simile, it compares men and girls to moths. What does it actually convey? And I think that is really important. And there's also you may not agree with the way I've done this. And there's so many, and the thing about beauty about literature is there are so many different ways to interpret different language techniques. All right, here's the next one. This is from Zombie and Son by Charles Dickens. There were frowsy fields and cow houses and dung hills and dust heaps and ditches and gardens and summer houses and carpet beating grounds at the very door of the railway. Now, this is a type of language technique that you may not have heard of, but can anyone notice what's special about this little passage here? Oh, yeah, someone said, yeah, sounds like it's rambling, which is, yep, awesome. It's actually this technique called, it's like a list, and it's called polysyndeton, where we continuously use this and. So there were frowsy fields and cow houses and dung hills and dust heaps, etc., 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 which is a type of syntax. And it kind of does exactly what you were talking about. It creates a sense of rambling. Whereas if we have an asyndeton, where we get rid of all our ands and just commas, it's almost like this dramatic, fast-paced, like firing list. But here it's just this idea of dung hills and cow houses, like this idea, this sense of like farming and tranquility at the very door of the railway is conveyed in the very syntax of how it's written. So the themes that Charles Dickens is discussing, this imagery he's trying to set up, is mirrored in the way he's actually writing the setup, which I think is so beautiful. And it does really convey a sense of gravity and also emphasizes a connection between these nouns. It really shows that the cow houses are connected to the dung hills, which are connected to the dust heaps, which are connected to the ditches and to the gardens and to summer houses, and all the way leading that to the railway. So there's no real link between fields and railway, but between each one of these, we're showing it's almost continuous flow. So what I'm trying to get at here is looking at the very syntax of our texts can be so useful and can really demonstrate a lot of good ideas. The final one here, and this one is a bit explicit, so I'm just going to put it, before you read, just a bit of a trigger warning, that they does discuss violence. This is from one of the VCE texts, and it's a text about anchorites, which are sort of a female like monk in England in like the 13th century. So it's just feel free to turn your sound down if you're worried about, if you're feeling uncomfortable. This does discuss violence, but she was so pale, a kind of yellow color, her bones in her shoulder stuck out sharp-like. Around her mouth were sores, dark red with dry blood. Her hair was orange like Elwyn told me. And this is from The Anchoress by Robin Cadwallader. So to illustrate that there are parts that we have to be looking at the entirety of the text, really. And authors can set, like, it's obviously a very distressing bit of imagery, and it's exactly right, it is imagery. But the way they set this sort of thing up, there's many different ways that we can discuss. So this is definitely imagery, and the way I thought about, the way I wrote about this very text in year 12 was this rainbow, this yellow color, sharp like, around her mouth were dark red and her hair was orange. It's kind of contrasting this beauty of a rainbow with this horrific scene. And it is a very horrific scene. It is quite like emotional, which this imagery strengthens the emotions that are connected to this scene and also helps reinforce this dichotomy between this beauty of a rainbow and the horrific acts that have happened. Okay. So when we're looking at technical language, if we analyze how a passage is written beyond what is superficial and obvious, we can get an indication of what the author has, consciously or not. That's a discussion for perspectives, but what they've placed emphasis on. So technical language is includes like repetition, metaphor, caesura, syntax, and connotations. So, for example, repetition drawing the reader to focus on a specific moment differs from repetition contributing to an atmosphere of unease and referencing common themes of the text. Melodic features, well, the key thing here is how poetry, scripts, or dialogue are read can dramatically change how they're understood. So melody, rhythm, and rhyme scheme can contribute to the emotion of a passage and give an indication of characters' beliefs and feelings. Melodic language features must always be considered in an analysis, always. Even if you're not doing a poem, always consider how a text sounds. Phonology, sibilance, assonance, fragmentation. A classic example here for those who are studying Sylvia Plath is that in some of her poems, there is a lot of fragmentation, a lot of like hyphens and ellipses that promote the caesura. And a classic example of really incorporating this in melodic features to give you a bit of history on Sylvia Plath, is that she, at the time of writing those poems, was suffering huge mental torment. She was very, very depressed. And we can kind of look at the way these poems are structured and broken up by the very sounds, the silences, can be indicative of her own fragmentation and her own breakdown. Constructive features. So engaging with constructive features relies on an awareness of the text as a whole. And the reason why I suggest using them is because it really shows that you know about the text beyond just the 3 passages that you're given in the exam. So stage directions, the physical layout of the play, conventions of a text. So traditionally, is a novel written in first person or third person? Meter, so the way syllables are stressed in a poem, and context are all really important in analysis. So it really demonstrates great understanding, which is why I recommend you use them. So tips for identifying language and writing about it. It's useless just saying there's a simile there, or there's a metaphor there. Link each language technique when you're writing with its purpose. Personally, I would always use adjectives to describe the language technique. Now, this you don't have to do, but I'd always, like, there's very much a difference between like an abrasive phonology, so like something that's quite jarring on the ears, and a soft, soothing phonology. So it really helps you affirm that you understand the effect of the language and not just the fact that you can identify it. So combining analysis of poetic features and language. So combining those can really help you present a complex interpretation of the text. Combining all these different types of analysis together shows that the interpretation you have of your text doesn't just come from 1 or 2 bits and pieces, it comes from the text as a whole. Include at least 1 reference to tonal shift in a first and second thought. This is advice I personally got from BCAR examiners. They really love to see this. Tonal shift is a type of language technique where the very tone of, usually like our novels, where even though nothing's explicitly stated, the tone and atmosphere of our scene has changed. Really important to mention, in my opinion. First and second thought just shows a bit of nuance. It's where you analyze a bit of language to say, well, it shows that this, and then you analyze another bit of language and say, well, having considered that second analysis, we can also potentially think that our first thing we've analyzed actually means this instead. So going back and readdressing other ideas, given the fact that you've had new evidence that supports something in a different way. And I will show you an example of that. I mention views and values and show how the passages are significant to the text holistically, because as I'll go over in a minute, you get 3 passages from your text to analyze, but we want to be looking at how those passages, well, we want to be looking first and foremost at what's written in those, and we want to analyze those first and foremost, but we also, to build that interpretation, link those back to the rest of the text, because we're not just studying 3 passages by themselves, we're studying an entire text, and your essay is just on those 3 passages. Okay, other thing should be obvious, but this is a classic stitch-up of lit students. The examiners know the story. They're an expert. They are literally experts in the books that you've nominated. You don't need to tell them what happens like after, so-and-so goes to the shops or whatever. It's a waste of time. You've got 1 hour to write each essay. Don't waste your time. Okay, so here is a sack that I did in year 12. And this is from a poem called My Last Duchess. It's pretty crazy. It's this guy, there's a tradesman coming into his hall. He's got this big dining room, and there's a picture of his old wife in the middle of the dining room. And it's like older Duke or something. And he's saying that, oh yeah, it's like this picture. Oh, I'm going to tell you about it. This is my old wife. Yeah, essentially I had her killed after I found that she was giving other men too much attention. And it's a really, really vivid and dramatic poem. So what I wrote about this, and this is in reference to the first and second thought, is curiously, while the poem's conformist skeleton of an AABB rhyme scheme and iambic pentameter presents a verisimilitude of real life than indeed romantic poetry, the aestheticized sensationalism of then all smiles stop together appears incongruous. Indeed, the circuitous euphemism of, quote, too soon made glad, emphasizes that my last start chess is reminiscent of a performance where the hyperphora of, how shall I say, imbues its simplistic rhyme scheme with a sense of rehearsal. So I've said I've analyzed language techniques, so aestheticized sensationalism, a euphemism, hyperphora, which is where you present a question. Hyperphora is where you ask a question and you immediately answer it. So hyperphora would be, what is a hyperphora? It's where you answer a question, ask a question, immediately answer it. That there is an example. The structure, so the conformist skeleton, the iambic pentameter, and then the actual melody, which is the AABB rhyme scheme, and again, simplistic rhyme scheme. So I've used all of these different ideas together to present this analysis. But what I've been saying is the rhyme scheme and the very simple meter, it presents it's almost like illustrative of real life. But yet, when we consider this euphemism of, it's almost like of too soon made glad, and this where he asks a question and immediately answers it, it kind of looks like a performance now. And then having seen that, the conformist skeleton and AABB rhyme scheme no longer look like real life. They actually look like it's all been designed to be part of a performance. So I'd really encourage you to be looking at these sort of ideas and seeing by themselves what do things represent, but in conjunction with other parts of the analysis, what do they represent as a whole? All right, so now we're jumping onto close analysis and we're going perfectly well time-wise, which is awesome. Section B, okay. We want to develop an informed interpretation of a text demonstrated by relevant and plausible interpretation. Now here's a classic stitch-up of VC students is they come up with these incredible interpretations to which they have no evidence. For example, something like Harry Potter. Every interpretation you can find evidence for, but it doesn't mean an interpretation is good in the sense of our marking scheme. So with Harry Potter, you could say Harry Potter is a story that warns us of the dangers of alien invasion. Now that obviously isn't true. There's no evidence to support that. It's a pretty dumb interpretation to make. But saying something like Harry Potter is a novel that explores the fantasies a child has to create after left orphaned, isn't explicitly true in the sense that that isn't what the text is about. But that's much more likely than Harry Potter being about aliens. So when we're thinking about interpretations, we want to be having our own unique interpretations of a text, but also making sure they're not so unique that they're not plausible. So explicitly what VCAR says is they want analysis and close reading of 2 of the 3 passages. Do not do this. You need to analyze all 3. You will not get good marks if you analyze just 2. Even if your analysis is just in depth of 2 of them, and then a sentence or 2 about your 3rd passage, that's fine. Make sure you write at least a sentence on all 3. So if you need, do in-depth analysis on 2, and then a sentence about number 3, but ideally you'd be doing in-depth analysis of all 3 given passages. And essentially you're analyzing how these key passages, moments, and views and values are suggested to contribute to an overall interpretation. They're not picking random paragraphs from the text. They're picking parts of the text for a reason. It would typically be something really important that happens in the text or something that alludes to something very important. So essentially, this is what section B looks like, and this is the amount of writing you have to analyze. There's a fair bit there. So this is a play right here. This is Very Child. Don't feel too stressed. Again, you just need to do in-depth analysis of 2, but ideally you would do in-depth, and that's very explicitly in-depth analysis of 3. And essentially you're writing an essay on language. So in literature, we use language as a stepping stone for interpretation. We derive the meaning of a text through the language it uses. although it's not stated, it is vital. Again, I know I'm stressing this a lot, but it is really important. It is vital that you address all 3 of the passages given, with in-depth analysis of 2 and mention of a 3rd required at the very least. And we draw meaning of the relationship between passages and the relationship between given passages and the text as a whole. So we're not just writing like a paragraph on paragraph 1, a paragraph on passage 2, a paragraph passage 3. We want to be making sure we're also writing about how passage 1 and 2 are linked and how passage 2 and 3 are linked, as well as how they're all linked to the overall text. So again, we're having an interpretation of an overall text with evidence from the 3 passages that we've been given. And quotation isn't good enough. You can't just say, like, just put random quotes in. Quote something and then comment on and analyze it. Analyze the nuances of the language used. Okay, so essentially how do we do this? First up, analyze the effect of the language device. Notice there's a simile, quote the simile, and tell us what it does. Then tell us how the effect lends itself to interpretation. So classic one, like the connotation of like mutt for dog. Like if an author is writing mutt, then they're probably not going to be talking about dogs in a good light. Well, how does that lend itself to interpretation? Or maybe they just don't like dogs. You know, that's very, very simplistic, but that's the sort of methodology you want to be going about. Analyze the effects and then discuss how the effect lends itself to interpretation. And then finally, we want to examine how the feature affects the reader's understanding, because that is the most important thing, is what the reader is thinking, what you are thinking. So another thing to just note from the VCAR study, from the exam report, is that the highest scoring essays were highly eloquent and were able to draw thoughtful and subtle connections between observations about the text and inferences made. Now, you're going to do well in VCE if you can draw analysis, but first and foremost, draw points of analysis and observation between text and interpretation. If you can analyze your text, you can and link that analysis of a language device to the interpretation. That's where you do well. It's not writing like poetically, although it is fantastic that people can do that. First and foremost, the thing you want to be practicing is your actual analysis. And the classic stitch up here is we read these high scoring exam reports and we think, oh, they write so beautifully. That's how we've got to write if we want to succeed. And no, they write so beautifully as a byproduct of being able to write well. Their content is good. That is what makes their writing beautiful. It's not the fact they use fancy words or the fact they sound nice. What I did in year 12 is I went through the exam reports and I wrote down every single word I didn't know. And then I tried to include all of those words into all my essays. And I can tell you that did not go well. Believe it or not, I didn't score well just because I was using big and fancy words. And honestly, by the time I think it was about end of term 3, I was looking at maybe a 35 in the end of year exam, which I would have been happy with. But then I started realizing you actually really need to understand the text and understand what the text is talking about well before you start writing poetically. And when I did that, and over the space of a couple of months, I jumped from a 35 student to a raw 48 student. So just to really demonstrate that, it is so important to be looking at the actual text and the inferences beyond just fancy language. And I just really want to stress that. Okay, structure. For close analysis, we don't need an intro, body paragraphs, and conclusion. We do not, and I want to preface that we do not need that. And so what I'm saying here is your intro should just be your first paragraph. You are not being assessed on your setting up of an essay. They do not care if you write a nice introduction. What they're examining you on is your analysis of language. So if you're going to write any sort of introduction, you should be jumping straight into the language. So immediately begin with analysis, but you also want to be giving us a little bit of a brief overview of your overall interpretation. Make sure you're stating an idea and then later you're building to an idea. With some sorts of essays, you have your contention, like you doing a year 10 English, you have your contention at the start and then you do signpost, do one paragraph for each thing and then conclude. With close analysis, I personally found it's much better to have a brief interpretation at the start and then slowly build more and more and more. And then at the end, you have a very detailed, complex interpretation. You can structure your paragraphs passage by passage, but the highest scoring responses are going to structure them theme by theme. Look at the theme shared between 2 passages and then that's your one paragraph. And the theme shared between passages 2 and 3, that's your second. So personally, I would always begin by comparing two poems. So I'll take you through what I would do. Okay. Whilst the soft phonology of place, pace, and face reiterate a simplicity inherent in romantic idolizations of love, the liberating blank verse of Fra Lippo Lippi, which is the name of another poem, forgoes the ordered asceticism in search for a sense of freedom that lies in the recognition of imperfection. So here I've compared a rhyme scheme of one poem to the lack of rhyme scheme in the other. But I've also said, I'm not just saying that it hasn't got a rhyme scheme, I'm saying that it's liberating, that having no rhyme scheme is saying they don't need this perfect setup to still be beautiful. I've compared those two. And indeed, as Browning litters his prose with ellipses and hyphens, the caesura he creates emphasizes a difficulty in articulating impressionistic concepts of soul, as the prior attempts to transfix Lippi's work into something more perfect. And again, here I've set up a bit of a contention about perfection and like impressionism. Here, Browning excoriates the imposition of one's own subjective truth, etc., etc. So I haven't just talked about one poem. I'm talking about multiple, and I'm linking those two poems together. When it comes to your structure, again, each paragraph should be focused on either a passage or a theme, so long as but you don't need a defined order. Ensure your analysis is expressive and insightful, so long as you're aiming to maintain an interpretation of the text throughout. The classic sit-up is getting an interpretation of like one theme of analysis, then analyzing the next theme and coming up with a completely different interpretation and not linking those two together. Our essay isn't about individual passages, they're about the passages as a whole. References should be made to views and values. The author, talk a little bit about the author, like the prime thing should definitely be the passages that we've been giving them to analyze, but to add on to that, to show that you can demonstrate that you know the text as a whole. Mention your views and values, mention your author, mention society beyond the text, as well as your key moments in the text. How do these points that we've been given relate to the overall themes or the overall like story that we've been given? And like with section A, it is really, really important to critique your own interpretation. Add stuff that you might not necessarily like, that might not necessarily agree with your interpretation, but show why overall this poet, for example, has presented a view of even though they have written something that's perfectly fits in with, say, like romantic poetry and like a beautiful structure, but yet everything else is written like in their own style. We'll talk about that because no human, remember we're writing about human authors, no human does everything the exact same way. Embrace the fact that we're all unique and all parts of the text are unique, and nothing's going to ever exactly conform to an interpretation. But that really is the beauty of literature. Okay, then when we conclude, we just want to make sure, again, don't have a proper conclusion like we would in mainstream, but make sure you continue with language analysis. Link, I think it's really important when you're wrapping up, is to link to important parts of the text, especially ending, and conclude your analysis with detailed, explicit interpretation. You spent all this time building up to an interpretation of the text, state it. Let the reader know, let the examiner know that you've come up with interpretation, and this is where you're ending. So, for example, in that same poem, the same essay that I was just reading, this is the end. Although conformity is inherent in the very bedrock of his poems, Browning's presentation of the very real world in which nothing is glamorized in Fra Lippo Lippi lends itself to the search of meaning in the bleakness of modernity. Indeed, in the rapidly changing world of the 19th century, Browning rejects the romantic discourse with which he has become familiarized for a tactile, albeit depressing reality. So when I started off in my introduction talking about Impressionism, I've ended up with this very complex and very detailed interpretation in total. That's where you want to get to. All right, so your checklists when you're writing this sort of analysis, check that you've cited beginnings, turning points, resolutions, etc., etc. You check that you've shown how the passages are holistically significant to the text. Check that you've actually analyzed the language and not just retold the story. Check that you've used a range of language features, and also check that you've introduced a basic interpretation, then use analysis to slowly build to a more complex interpretation of the text as a whole. And oh, that's one that there's messed up. But and check that you haven't just analysed passages individually. Interpretation must be maintained and throughout, and analysis should be interlinked. All right, so here we've got a bit of a poem, and this is what our little practice is going to be. This here is The Applicant by Sylvia Plath, and it's absolutely fantastic. Normally I get you guys just to read it, but I think because it's poetry, I'm happy to read this out. And what I want you guys to do when you're listening to this, look at your language techniques, think about them, think about how everything sounds, and we'll have a bit of a discussion afterwards. Okay. First, are you our sort of a person? Do you wear a glass eye, false teeth, or a crutch, a brace or a hook, rubber breasts or a rubber crotch? Stitches to show something's missing? No? No? Then how can we give you a thing? Stop crying, open your hand. Empty? Empty. Here is a hand to fill it and willing to bring teacups and roll away headaches and do whatever you tell it. Will you marry it? It is guaranteed to thumb shut your eyes at the end and dissolve of sorrow. We will make new stock from the salt. I notice you are stark naked. How about this suit? Black and stiff, but not a bad fit. Will you marry it? It is waterproof, shatterproof, proof against fire and bombs through the roof. Believe me, they'll bury you in it. Now your head, excuse me, is empty. I have a ticket for that. Come here, sweetie, out of the closet. Well, what do you think of that? Naked as paper to start, but in 25 years she'll be silver and 50 gold, a living doll everywhere you look. It can sew, it can cook, it can talk, talk, talk. It works. There is nothing wrong with it. You have a hole, it's poultice. You have an eye, it's an image. My boy, it's your last resort. Will you marry it? Marry it. Marry it. The Applicant by Sylvia Plath. That's a pretty profound poem, and Sylvia Plath is one of my favourite authors of all time, and again is one of the VCE authors. And this is just a little bit of a practice for your analysis. So what I'm going to do is just set up another Mentimeter, where I would love for everybody to, I'm just going to share this. Give me 1 second. And let me just present. General thoughts. So what do we think? What do we think about that poem? What's it like? What's it actually talking about? Oh, I just mark all these as answered, sorry. Okay, what are your general thoughts about The Applicant? Also, I did see there was that question about eating challenges that we'll do all those other questions a bit later. What do you think about that poem? Feel free to also just unmute yourself and talk as well if it's a bit easier. Nothing? That's all right. We're going to go through it in just a second anyway, so that is A-okay. I'll just share my screen again. Give me 1 second. All right. Okay, so this poem is a dramatic monologue, and I think the really important thing is that it sort of sounds like a conversation, and yet it's only one person talking. It's only the speaker speaking. The applicant who we're talking about doesn't actually say anything. And essentially, this is a poem that's assessing whether the applicant will make a good husband. The speaker brings a potential wife out of this cupboard and builds up an illusion that the applicant direly needs a wife. Like it's almost like a sales pitch, which on one hand is super creepy that the speaker is trying to sell, a woman like that. It's just a little. It was very unnerving, stripping the woman of their agency, and it also offers this commentary on consumerism, this idea of like materialism and looking at the fact that when we sell stuff, we're not just selling items, we're selling people's lives and people's livelihoods. It also presents this very narrow definition of masculinity with like one proper answer. So this gentleman can't have anything wrong, or not even wrong, but he can't have any sort of condition that means he lies outside of the continuum that society places as normal, even though he is might necessarily be perfectly awful, perfectly normal. So the speaker simultaneously denies the applicant and the potential wife identity and individualism. He's saying you must be part of this society, must be exactly who we want you to be. This repetition that you see is very common, and there's no real rhyme scheme or proper meter, but this variability actually succeeds in creating an illusion of conversation. The fact that there is no rhyme scheme, there is this different lengths of lines, kind of shows us that it kind of almost lends the idea that the speaker is having a conversation, even though there's just one person talking. And the bit of context here, and again, just a bit of a trigger warning, Plath did unfortunately commit suicide shortly after Anthology was released. And some of her poems are incredibly depressing in nature, and this isn't one of the more depressing ones, but it is still a pretty bleak outlook on life. And so the fraction and depressing nature of the poem, it really does give us a bit of insight into her mental status, and it is an important thing to touch on when we're looking at analysis, because the author, even though we talk about death of the author in the sense of literary criticism, when we're looking at language analysis, the author and the author's own environment is so important to give us an idea of why something was written the way it was. Okay. So I'm going to go through this just bit by bit. This is a bit heavy, so please bear with me. We're going to go paragraph by paragraph, stanza by stanza. So first, are you our sort of person? The R implies a larger organization. So the speaker isn't just talking about, are you my sort of person? Are you who I want you to be? But like a larger business. And it could be like, business selling off something. But much more likely, it's society itself. This is a critique of society itself. The very nondescript setting, so the fact that nothing is mentioned of the environment, kind of forces the reader into the applicant's shoes. Like, we have to imagine what their environment is like. Therefore, we are very much pushed into that role. The sort of person also confines masculinity into a binary, and the stress syllables of or a crutch, or a hook, rubber breasts, or a rubber crotch, the polysyndeton and the repeated R sounds kind of invokes like a very guttural, aggressive tone. So it's almost like, the way I imagine it is the speaker is almost like pushing the reader, not physically, but like with their voice, pushing the reader back into a chair where they can almost interrogate them. Next, we have stitches to show something's missing. So this sibilance can be quite hard to pronounce. So the stitches to show something's missing. It emphasizes this like fast-paced tone. This is the fourth question of the poem, and it also the very fast-paced tone sort of doesn't give us a second to think about it, and it normalizes this discrimination against people who do have something's missing or have stitches. So again, people, like I say, socially deviant, but people who don't fall within that binary that society suggests is normality. The hyperphora, so empty, and also show something's missing, no, also furthers a sense of very quick conversation, and also foreshadows the entry of a woman's hand. Like this answering the question now by the speaker who's proposed the question also suggests that like they think they have the answer to everything. They think society is the answer to everything. And here we have like this lack of enjambment more than we did in the first paragraph. Stop crying, open your hand. Very imperative demands. And it symbolizes a sense of finality. Like the speaker is having a conversation, but what they say goes. There is no room for disagreement. Okay. Here is a hand to fill it and willing to bring teacups and roll away headaches and do whatever you tell it, will you marry it? This imagery of this disembodied hand parallels this thematic misogyny. Like the whole theme of the poem is reducing the female character of her agency. And that's done right at the start by comparing her to just being a hand. The way she's described is she's not an individual. She is just like almost reduced to domestic duties, and really dehumanizes her. And this objectification and consumerist like guarantee, it is guaranteed, sort of ties this monologue to a sales pitch. And again, sorry, just to reiterate, this is all my interpretation of the poem. You don't necessarily have to agree with me, or you might think what I'm saying is complete rubbish. But I think it's important to hear different other ideas, just so you can get a more substantiated interpretation of any sort of poetry or any sort of close analysis, full stop. Then eyes at the end and dissolve sorrow. So this vivid imagery, dissolve of sorrow, almost like someone crying and then like almost their tears like from a pool and they just wash away. It's this poetic tapestry that suggests that, that shows that the speaker is suggesting that that this codependency between who he's suggesting the applicant should marry as and men in general, which we know isn't true. Like the codependency isn't like we know today in society that's just an awful thing to be saying. But Sylvia Plath is suggesting that this is what the speaker, who we think is representative of society in general, thinks. We, which is again is that reference to wider society, we will make you new stock from the salt. Now, here is our first and second thought. This is where this comes in. So salt and new stock sort of furthers a connection to the woman being sold, where the deeply impersonal allusions to salt of the earth, like normality, indicates that this is how women are generally regarded in this society. But we can also look at salt as a pithy euphemism or like metaphor for tears. When we think of someone crying, having their agency stripped from them, and again, dissolve in sorrow, or the salt of one's tears. So this salt has two different meanings at the same time. Now for our final half. So this fit, it, proof, roof, it. It's almost like a limerick, the way the rhyme scheme is. And it's the first time we have a really almost proper like rhyme scheme. And which imbues like this sense of familiarity, but also like fit and it aren't very good rhymes. Proof and roof aren't fantastic rhymes either. And the simplicity suggests the speaker is trying to make the rhyme scheme suggests rather that the speaker is trying to make the applicant more comfortable, but the speaker doesn't really put any effort into it. There's no real it's just fit and it. That's not that hard. So even though it's almost like a pretense of making someone feel comfortable. And this absolute lack of an answer from the eponymous applicant, so the applicant after which the poem is named, parallels like this protector role. So they'll bury you in it. Like this is the very hegemonic, like this hegemonic masculine role that the applicant is forced to be pushed into. So just as Plath is suggesting that women are disregarded and pushed into a box, she's also suggesting that to some degree men are as well. Now, naked as paper to start is very much reductionist. Like comparing someone to paper, comparing someone's nakedness to paper, is this like alongside this description of like out of the closet, well, what do you think of that? Is quite horrific, and it's quite like this illustrates the speaker's belief that the speaker believes that women are nothing more than what like the speaker makes of them. And Plath does this, and it is so like unnerving, and like makes the readers feel very uncomfortable. That the applicant's head is empty alludes to his previous stanza, and it's like feigned politeness, like, now your head, excuse me, is empty. Like it's almost like polite, but it's not. It's actually really rude. Like you can't just tell someone their head is empty. Like who would do that? And kind of resembles, and this is what a lot of literary perspectives think about this poem, but like we idolize like consumerism and corporations for doing the bare minimum. And society as a whole, like with governments, like we are very impressed with our governments, for example, when they do something that's minimum where they could be doing much better. Here is our final big few bits. In 25 years, she'll be silver and 50 gold. So the wife is framed as an investment. She's not framed as a person. She's like, her value will accrue over time. The shorting lines and near rhymes like contribute to this very much this quickening of the quickening of pace, which contributes to like, this closing of the deal. Where the repetition of talk simultaneously alludes to the climax of the sales pitch. So talk kind of builds up like a climax. And the crescendo of the poem's thematic misogyny arrives with this comparison: a living doll. This, like, it's disgusting. And Plath strips the woman of her agency, just as she feels like society has stripped herself of her own agency. And she presents this very, very real and very dramatic, like mirror, or this story of her beliefs of how she feels like she's been treated in society. And again, almost speed up, we have this it works, like there's nothing wrong with it. It's a poultice, it's an image, it's your last resort. The speaker is becoming most desperate to close this sale, to rid the woman of her femininity. And likewise, this desperation is mirrored with an emphatic pleas. This is one of the first times the speaker really says you, refers to the applicant consistently. You have a hole, you have an eye, my boy, it's your last resort. My boy. He's actually quite rude to the applicant, and now he's trying to solve, like almost like close this deal up. So now it's being impassioned. And then finally, will you marry it, marry it, marry it? Every other time it's been a question, will you marry it? Now it's a demand. The will you is almost just a throwback to every other time they've said it. But marry it, marry it, marry it. And it's like the knocks are like a hammer, like nailing the coffin closed. So I think that's a metaphor there. But they're repetitive, misogynistic knocks. They're closing up the poem, nailing like the coffin in femininity as it's like closed in the matrimonial market. Yes, this is quite a full-on poem. But essentially, when you're reading your poetry, you're reading your own text for close analysis, what you guys should be doing is going through like this. Not necessarily writing all out, but underlining and highlighting the different parts of your text. The things that really resonate with you, like the ideas that you have, just so you can come up with ideas like this, essentially. All right, so for the final bit here, we have a analysis on a couple of poems, and this is a bit of analysis on that poem we just discussed. So this is the first paragraph of a VCAR examiner's report. Also, this is the second paragraph. So the first paragraph establishes this contention of dichotomy of like society and existence. And now the second paragraph moves on to the applicant. So it starts talking about this evocation of societal expectations frames a contemplation of entrapment. Through the repetitions of the words rubber, rubber, and empty, empty, reinforced through the evocation of waterproof, shatterproof proof that echoes the bombs in the following line within the applicant, Plath conveys the notion of entrapment, whereby the repetition of the language forms an unbreakable barrier that cannot be penetrated. This is further emphasized in the striking final line. The repetition of will you marry it, marry it, marry it, the line of it betraying a central theme of objectification of woman. Moreover, Plath's evasion of the confines of convention, namely the exclusion of a question mark at the end of the sentence, transforms the phrase into a statement, whereby the bridal figure is trapped without question. Plath depicts that the living doll was naked as paper to start, betraying the recurring notion of the self-depreciation which echoes throughout her poetry, where the speaker views herself as a shadow of thin and tenuous cut paper, reflecting the effacement of her self-identity. Pretty powerful stuff. So essentially, what's going on here is there's consistent quotation that's always linked to an effect. They're not just quoting stuff randomly. They're saying, this is a quote, this is what it's doing, and then this is how it adds to my overall interpretation. It makes reference to the form of the poem, like conventions of the poem, as well as reference to the wider mythology. So it mentions that the fact that these themes aren't just in this poem. They're actually in other poems that we're not going to analyze today. That's what it's sort of saying. And it uses quotation to further contention beyond just analysis. But so that's a really important thing. So like living doll was naked paper to start, or reflecting the effacement. So they've got some quotation there that like sort of adds on to what they're saying, but by far the majority of the quotation is very strictly analyzed. It's showing what's being done. And also it makes explicit reference to which poems they're discussing and links wider themes shared by all three poems. So it says the applicant. So you want to be mentioning what passage you're actually talking about when you're doing your analysis. All right, this bit here is the final part of the fifth paragraph. And then this is the end. Final part of the fifth paragraph and the conclusion. So, however, the world then turns clear as water. indicating the transparency of the suffering of the world, illustrated through the red shed and the intensification of pink to red, epitomizing the very duality within Plath's poetry in which suffering and creativity are inextricably intertwined. The bloodshed is poetry implicating pain as a catalyst for meaning. Thus, Plath evokes that amongst the dark crime, there will always be possibility for blessings, constituting the essence of her poetry. Now, this bit here is analysis of a poem we didn't cover. We cover the applicant, but you can see how these sort of ideas of suffering and art are linked to the idea of like commodification and suffering but on society's hands. Finally, the author of this essay wraps everything up. Plath's poetry offers us a courageous truth that elucidates the plight of those attempting to understand the ambivalence of the human experience. Through illuminating the contemplation of identities and the confines of convention, Plath ultimately creates a raw depiction of experience, encapsulating and deploying the mechanism of literature to depict the transiency of humanity amongst the timeless capacity of the elements. How beautiful is that? That is such a well-written piece of work, and you can tell that it's not just eloquent, it's talking about a lot of things. So this links back to ideas that we were just discussing about identities and also the confines that society places on us of our societal conventions. And the fact is, when we're looking at this and what we're talking about is Plath in that poem, it's very real and it's very unnerving, the way that Plath has the speaker dehumanize people. Plath creates a very raw depiction of experience. This is almost like untamed, and encapsulating and employs a mechanism of literature to depict the transiency of humanity. So humanity isn't as simple as we let on. It's so much more, and you can see that in that poem we discussed. We have the speaker, we have the applicant, and we have the potential wife, who are all very different people with very different experiences. Yeah, and also the other thing to note there is that although in my mind it's like almost like the applicant's like almost like a 80s, 1990s like interview, that sort of thing that goes on in my head, Plath never states it. So for anyone else, the environment that poem conjures could be completely different, and that there links again to the timeless capacity of humanity and of the elements. Yes, so I've just covered that there. So the essay does start with this overall overview of like collision between ephemeral existence and like external forces, eternal forces rather, and they use language analysis to continue to build on that idea, and then results in this big interpretation, which is their last paragraph. That is their interpretation of that last paragraph. All right, so analysis tips. You don't need to define structure, and it's wasteful, frankly, to start with a mainstream-like introduction. You're being assessed in your ability to analyze language. Don't waste 10 minutes talking about like the setting of the play unless it's strictly relevant to what you're analyzing. At least one reference should be made to tonal shift and first and second thought. We talked a bit about that earlier. Likewise, references to the author and their own personal beliefs and experiences and the time period strengthens your demonstration of textual knowledge, so long as it's linked to the stuff you're talking about. It's one thing to say, you know, this play is like it's set in post-war society, and then going on and talking about like the I don't know, the way characters interact with each other. But if you were to say this text is set in post-war, like a post-World War II society, then talking about the hopes for the future, well, there's a clear link between those ideas. So make sure where you can link references to the author. Interpretation shouldn't be something as simple as explaining a plot point or character point. Like, that's not what an interpretation is. An interpretation has got something to do with is specific, interesting, and engaging, and usually has something to do with with the world beyond the text, like how the author thinks we should act or think, or how society should be, or what society says about certain ideas. Okay, so it is 12:15 right now. We're going to do another quick Q&A, and feel free to take a break. We've got 45 minutes left, so we'll take a break for maybe 5-10 minutes, and then we're going to just cover some stuff on actual preparing for the exam, tackling more exam content, and everything like that. Yes, and we'll do a Q&A. If anyone has any questions though about what we've just covered, feel free to write in chat, and we can get on to answering those. Hopefully a lot of that's made sense. So that is a general overview of those two parts of the exam. And that's how we want to tackle the exam and how we want to practice. And now, of course, yeah, we're going to cover how to plan, how to actually tackle it, and all the other things everyone needs to be doing. But feel free for the moment. Feel free for the moment to take a break, go grab a drink of water, do whatever you want. I'm just we'll do the Q&A again. Yeah, and so going back to that poem, yeah, it's criticizing, yeah. Okay, clarifying what first and second thoughts are again. Okay, fantastic. So a first and second thought is, okay, so we come along and we analyze a bit of the poem, for example, a bit of the text, a bit of the play. And we say, okay, this technique here lends us to an interpretation of, for example, the rigid confines of society. And then we go on and analyze something else that suggests something a little different. And then we say, well, given that this second language technique has presented us with this idea, if we look at the first language technique, overall, even though it suggests one thing in the first place by itself, overall, there seems to be this idea that, in fact, the text is saying that this is the best way society could be, for example. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, it does.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, how much should you write? Yeah, fantastic question. I think the general goal is like 1,000 words, but the reason why I didn't say anything is because close analysis, again, isn't like, if there's no defined structure, you could write the best essay in the world and it could be 500 words, and someone else could write like I know 10,000 words and it just be, I mean, if you're writing 10,000 words, you could probably, most of it's going to be absolute nonsense. But I reckon the general goal is 1,000 words. When you practice though, I would highly recommend you practice writing because I'm assuming that's how the exams are going to be this year. That's how they are every year. And that's how you need to practice, I think. But really, you should write down enough that you've done in-depth analysis of all three passages. I think that's your general goal. How many paragraphs? Oh, okay. So I've got a bit of a story here. Okay, so we were told in high school that you could do as many as you wanted, just as long as you answer everything. Now, you really could do one paragraph the entire time. Like you could, but like, why would you? Like, you want to do a paragraph per theme. And one of my friends said, okay, I'm gonna write like 20 paragraphs. And he wrote like some of his paragraphs would be like 1 sentence long, or 2 sentences long. And I think, again, that's the complete other end of the spectrum. That's not a good idea either. You don't want to be doing that. But for VCE literature, how many paragraphs should you write? I would aim for like 4 or 5 personally, and I would write quite big paragraphs. Personally, I reckon, or maybe even 5 or 6 was my personal goal, but entirely depends on your writing style. What I'd recommend doing is experiment. Write some essays. Trying only to write 3 paragraphs or writing like 6 or 7 paragraphs, and see how you feel at the end of it. See what you think worked best for you. I think because literature isn't like a defined set structure or a way to tackle anything. That's the beauty of literature. It is entirely up to you. Okay. I didn't really do well my SACs. Is it too late for me to do well? No, it's not too late. Do not stress whatsoever. The good thing about VCE, it's a pretty tough system, and there's a lot of, on one hand, there's a lot of pressure placed on the exam. 50% of your score is the exam. So, like, the exam is half your score. If you can smash the exam out, you're going to do well. The idea that like I didn't really do well in my SACs, that's fine, because not every school has the same SAC. For example, we could both be in different schools, and like I could get like 90% and someone else could get 30%, but it doesn't mean that the first person with the high score is better. It might just mean they have an easier SAC, and the person who got 30% in class may end up doing better, because how VCE works, they don't actually, when they look at your school grades, they don't actually look at the grades. They look at like what place you came in the class. So if you did well in your class, no matter what score you got, it's easier to do well in the exam. But essentially, how well, like what your ranking in your class correlates to is based entirely on the exam. So even if you did amazingly in your SACs, not doing well on the exam means your entire score has dropped down. So technically it's actually more than 50% of your score, but it is 50% just the exam score alone, but the exam score determines your score for your schoolwork. So essentially, yeah, you can do, like, I know people who got high 40s after, sitting towards the bottom of my class. And one of my best mates, he did PE when he was in year 11, did PE 3-4. I know this is like literature, but like just an example. He did PE 3-4 and he didn't like school. But then he decided he wanted to do medicine, and he's actually one of my closest mates to my university degree. And he put his head down and he said, I'm going to work really, really hard. And he ended up getting a 50, even though he was placed like 14th or 15th in his class. So 50 being the perfect score there, purely on the fact that he did incredibly well on the exam. So, that's a bit of a message for you. Oh, people memorize full, no, God, no. Because with your section A, every single essay is going to have a different prompt. What I would do, I would memorize skeletons. Like, I wasn't even memorize them, but I would always have the same style of writing. For close analysis, I'd always have a roughly the same intro. Like, I'd always talk about the phonology and link that to like another form of like free verse or whatever, but I would never write the same essay. And again, with section A, I would always have a rough idea of what I wanted, like rough structure, talking about postmodernism or talking about the play, and then mentioning the prompt. But again, every single exam is different. You're never going to get the same set of passages in section B as you would in practice. For you to be able to, like, let's say you've got 12 poems to study, for you to be able to write down an exact replica of your essays, you would need to have done, you would have need to have done an essay on like sets of 3 of all 12 poems and memorized all of them. That's impossible. It's not a good idea to do that. Better idea is to be practiced. And when it comes to section A, it could be a little easier, I guess, but realistically answering a prompt. And that prompt, you're never going to see the prompt. Like, there's so many different ways they can write a prompt, is that you're never going to see the one you're going to get in the exam in practice. So again, it is all about practice. It is not about memorizing. It's in fact, memorizing is a pretty destructive way of doing it, because you are so set on an idea that when you get to the exam and then the prompt doesn't actually lend itself to that idea, you end up doing poorly, essentially. Don't memorize. It is my personal advice. Maddie, do you want to take this one?
I think people, like, when you get your ATAR, maybe it'll be a bit later this year actually, but there's always like a little bit of discussion, but you don't have to, like, it's a bit invasive sometimes how people can ask. Like, if you don't feel comfortable sharing your ATAR, then you don't need to. But then at the same time, like, it really, after uni starts, people really do forget about your ATAR. Like, no one cares about it. You're at uni, you're doing what you want to study, you're happy studying that. And now, like, they're more focused about their uni marks. And then, like, I finished school 3 years ago and people don't talk about it. We're not worried, but we're more concerned with like WAM and getting the best marks we can at uni and just studying hard.
And it's the same thing like after uni as well, obviously. Like, no one asks, for example, their doctor.
Like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, no one asks their doctor what grade they got in medical school.
Yeah, exactly. So you like outlive your ATAR, and then you outlive, like, they're all important, like steps and like stepping stones, but you end up outliving those as you progress.
100%. Yeah. Like, the reason why I bring it up at the start of the lecture is just to show that I do have the experience, and I know sort of what I'm talking about. But beyond that, there's no reason, like, you're with people in your course from a range of different backgrounds, from so many different experiences and lives. And the fact is, ATAR is literally just a number for you to get into a course or for you to do something. Like, it honestly matters. Like, I know in year 12, I was very neurotic about my ATAR, and I was like, I had to get a certain goal. But in reality, it's not make or break. It is definitely not make or break. You can do so many things, even if you don't get the score you want. and there's so many allowances to help you get into university programs or into tertiary education or whatever, even if you don't necessarily get the school you necessarily wanted. So
Totally.
it's a goal, but it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, there's like lots of options you can investigate because a lot of people when they start uni, they'd probably realize they're in the wrong degree for them. So then they hadn't considered other options before, and then it's not only until after school that they're exploring all the other avenues.
Definitely. Also, people, sorry, I had to skip over your questions earlier. Whoever had questions from last time, feel free to write those in as well on the Mentimeter. The marks of your class drag down your study score does have a big influence. Oh, okay. The VC system, again, is a bit weird. No. Ultimately, the biggest determinant in your score is your exam score. That being said, it is so, like, if, let's say, you're ranked third in the class and the person who's ranked first doesn't do well in the exam, then that will pull you down a little, which is why it's so important to be studying together. Like, in your SACs, maybe it's a competition to, do well, to beat each other. But in the exam, the better your cohort does at school, the better the 8 or 9 kids you're doing literature with, the better you do, the better everyone does. So if you can pull everyone up, you can do well. But that being said, it's much easier to pull everyone up than it is for everyone to be pulled down by a bad score. So do not stress whatsoever. The classic example here, like for me, our methods exam 2 was derived for me. So I ended up getting a raw 48 in methods because I know I mentioned at the start I live quite rurally, but to illustrate that, during my methods exam, a ball escaped from the cattle yards next door and got into the school, and they had to shoot it during our methods exam. And so obviously we couldn't complete the exam, so we got a derived score. And because we got a derived score, and there were some people in our class who were going to do very well and did very well in the first exam, that pulled everyone's score up. But they made it explicitly clear, if people didn't do well in the first exam, it wouldn't pull the score down. So having your class having bad marks per se won't affect you that much, but your class having good marks will drag you up, which is why it's so important to work together. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Anyone have any other questions from earlier? Or is there something in the chat? Yeah, it is literally like a 1 in a million story. I know, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
I had a question as well.
Sorry, what was that?
So I had a question as well.
Yeah, go for it.
So you know how in close analysis, is it supposed to be one passage per paragraph? Okay.
Up to you. Really, you could do one passage per paragraph. You could have 3 paragraphs, one per passage.
Yep.
But the whole idea is to make sure that you have a developed and a concise response, right? So it's you're checking, what you want to be analyzing is the links between passages and the links between the passages and the text as a whole. So you could do one per paragraph per passage, and then at the end talk about how they link together. But in my opinion, the best way to do it is mix the analysis together. So you definitely could, and that's definitely a starting stone. I would recommend. That's what I did. I started off writing passage per passage, and it's definitely a good way to start off. But if you're confident, definitely try theme by theme. Talk about look at all your poems, for example, and say, okay, these 2 poems both talk about the beauty of nature. Poems 1 and 2. The poems 2 and 3 talk about the human experience. So in your first paragraph, you talk about passages 1 and 2, and then you'd use passage 2 to link into those ideas of human experience, and then you can bring in passage 3. That's personally how I would do it.
Okay, thank you.
No stress. So whoever's asked this question, what do you mean by which literary language features a more prominent passage analysis instead of CP? Is that the critical perspectives?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no stress. Well, really, you could, the text that you do for close analysis, passage analysis, is the text that I could be doing for critical perspectives. You can do any text, but essentially what you're looking at, I guess, is close analysis, passage analysis. You want to be looking at more like looking at the nitty-gritty parts of language, the nuances of the language, what the language is telling us. Whereas with critical perspectives, we're looking at the language for 100%, but you remember you're not given passages. You can also be looking at themes and ideas as a whole. So almost the way to think about it is passage analysis is more microscopic. You're more like tearing apart like the actual ingredients of the text, whereas I think this is a really bad analogy, but critical perspectives is more macroscopic. So you're more looking from a zoomed out view to look at the big parts of the text, like the themes, the context, the character arcs, etc., etc. No stress whatsoever. Alrighty. If no one has any more questions, I'm happy to keep going. Does that sound all right for everyone? Okay, fantastic. Alrighty. Give me 1 second, everybody. Okay. Getting exam ready. Okay, here's our last little section for today. Okay, so what we're going to be discussing is essentially the things we need to be thinking about before we tackle the exam, the nitty-gritty parts of language and of our texts. So today we've covered section A and section B, and I hope I've made it clear like what you need to do there, and gone through some examples. But if you're in doubt at any point, read the examiner's reports, and they have some exemplar examples. They're fantastic examples, and don't look at the language they use, look at how they've constructed their responses. But now what we want to talk about is more of the nitty-gritty parts of getting exam ready. So first up, context. Historical and authorial context is incredibly important for analysis. If we're reading a book like one of Shakespeare's plays, like if we're reading Twelfth Night, the story it's telling us is going to be dramatically different if we're saying, oh, if we know Shakespeare was born during medieval England, as compared if we think he's like a Japanese man from the 1990s, understanding the culture and the time of the period in which like the author is from and also the play is written in is hugely important. That context is hugely important because it will tell us different ideas about society. So a key principle in VC Lit is to discuss the principles embedded in the text, the views and values. And these principles will essentially have dramatically different meanings depending on who wrote them and when they were written. Like talking about like equal rights for men and women is obvious in the 20th and 21st century, or we're talking about equal rights for men and women in the 20th century when we're talking about like the rights to vote being equal, so women's suffrage. But that same discussion of equal rights for men and women way back in the 1300s is going to be hugely different because the perspectives around gender and sex were so different back then as compared to more recently. And again, then we talk about there's the queer perspective that some people use, where you look at heteronormativity and the way queer characters are presented in texts, and looking at a text from say this decade through that perspective is going to be vastly different from say looking at that same text in 1950s America, where we had that whole idea of the lavender scare and where Americans generally thought that people who weren't heteronormative were communist spies. Like there's some insane things that happened in the US then. So that's why context is so important. So there are things to think about when considering views and values. Has there been recent conflict? Classic one is World War II, but even like wars or even political conflict, like think about that in the context of the author when the book was written, and also when is the text set, because that can also give us a pretty good indication. What's the economic situation like? There is someone writing a text in a communist country as compared to a very neoliberal capitalist country. If we don't know that, like we can come up with some interpretations that could talk about economics, but it's so important for us to know where this is set and where the author is from. Because, so for example, a book condemning communism written by an American is very different from a book condemning communism written by someone who lived through the USSR. So this is why it's so important, and therefore you can relate personal experiences of a fictional book to whatever. For example, and is there a grand narrative? Now, when we talk about grand narratives, this is a very postmodern idea, but essentially it's this like themes and stories that govern us. The classic one there is the American dream. If you're writing a text about America in the early to middle 1900s, you would be very silly to not write about the American dream. This idea of soldiers coming back home from war, the idea of the nuclear family, were hugely influential. This idea of Americanisms, the American expansion across the world, for example, these are all massive ideas that have to be considered in the context of a text. And I know I'm going on about this a lot, and you might be thinking, but literature is just writing. That is so true. But what I'd recommend everyone does for the text that they're really passionate about, this is what I did, is do a bit of research, make a document, talk about, like, for example, Cat on Hot Tin Roof. I did a bit of research into the baby boom, it's set like after the Dust Bowl, which is huge economic collapse. We also got to consider something like Cat on Hot Tin Roof, which is the play we discussed at the start of the lecture, takes place in an old slave plantation, where they're still where the culture still very much resembles that pre-abolition era. Considering context like this is inherent and is the hallmark of a good analysis in BCE. When you read your analyses on the exam reports, you will see the best ones are the ones that talk about the external world. They talk about the American dream, talk about the all-American hero, etc., etc. What did the author think of society? Again, a classic one. A classic example here is George Orwell and 1984. A lot of people say 1984 it like condemns communism and like is a discussion about how bad communism is. But George Orwell was actually a socialist. So 1984 is much more likely to be a book that talks about authoritarianism, that talks about very controlling governments as compared to very controlling governments who are communist. Understanding this, understanding an author's own political views, is hugely important to understanding their beliefs about like a story. And it can, like, having an interpretation that kind of doesn't match up with what the classical interpretations could be is fantastic because it's unique, but you're also going to make sure the reason why it doesn't match up is because it's unique and not because it's implausible. All right, views and values need to be mentioned to score highly. I want to reiterate that like understanding author and setting is really important because this tells us about views and values, and views and values are specifically mentioned in the scoring guide for BCE. So I want everyone to question contextual views and values, the period's views and values, and the author's views and values. In the context of when the play or the text is set, what are the views and values? What do people believe in general? In the period it's written, so if it's like written in 2000s about the 1900s, or in the 2000s, what are the views and values that are predominant? Like what things have been happening? And finally, that's what society-wide, but what does the author individually think about society, think about the notions presented in the text? How I did this, for example, and I'll give you this. So this is The Anchoress by Robin Cadwallader, and this is the analysis I wrote on it. Now this book is like from 2017. So it's not like there's tons of essays about it, like there is for Shakespeare, and not like there's tons of information about it either. But essentially what happens in this text is that there's abuse that happens in the church in like the 13th century, where people who aren't viewed as religious get kicked out of the church. And so what happens is that the priest condemns the church, but still was in love with God and still was in love with his religion. And this kind of matches with, I literally just found a random article about the author that said she was religious, she's Roman Catholic, but she doesn't like the church. And that sort of matches up between that character and the author. So I said, whilst juxtaposed against the violence of the bishop's zealotry, The inherent patience of the gently toned, weighted, and deep breath exemplifies the multifaceted nature of faith in Cadwalladr's delineation of 13th century society. So, essentially saying there that the author's demonstration of 13th century society has shown us how different faith is. Faith isn't just one thing. Indeed, that Ranulph's belief in God is not compromised by his iconoclastic investigation into what folk said, the bishop did, embodies Cadwalladr's own self-admitted dissonance with the church and not Roman Catholicism itself. And so I was lucky enough to have a teacher who knew a VC marker, and this essay was marked by a VCAR marker, and they said that this bit here alone scored me a couple of marks because I was able to link an author that isn't traditionally talked about and link their beliefs into the actual text. So understanding that the author's beliefs can be very easily represented, very easily discussed in a text is so important. All right. Exam scoring. Language must be concise and eloquent and ensure you answer the question asked using a perspective and deeply analyze all three passages. And you also want to make sure the examiner understands you've got a wider knowledge of the texts than what is just supplied. So, like, for example, a classic trick people do for section A, where you get the prompts, is they look for that same book in section B and just quote the passages that they've been given. Now, that's fantastic, but the examiners know you do that. So making sure you have quotes memorized, key points memorized, shows the examiner that you're not just relying on what they've given you. And this link here is just the just a link to the VC literature page. If you search up VC literature page on Google, it will come up with all of the score descriptors. So how to score in, like what you need to do to score within each score range, all of the old exams, all of the exam reports where they discuss where people messed up, or they discuss where people did how people did in each text, for example, as well as the study design. So that's really, really important. Okay, so this here is from 2018. And you can see here the essay 1, essay 2, section A, section B, the average marks. So the average 12.2 for section A and 11.9 for section B. The reason why section B is lower could be something to do with if you write a text, if you write poetry in section A and you write poetry in section B, you will get an automatic 0 for section B. There have to be two different types. I know I said this at the start, but I just want to reiterate. There has to be two different types of text. If you're going to write about poetry in section A, you have to write out something else in section B. But you can see most people scored in the 10 to 11 point range. 12 to 13 point range. Same as down here. So the average mark here is around 12 marks. And as we look on this graph, our raw score, based on our assessment scores, if we get about 60%, that correlates with a 30. So a 30 is the mean score, is the average score, a study score. So getting a C+ in the exam is about 60%, and that will give you a study score of 30. Whereas to get, say, a 45, you want to be looking at close to 90%, and getting a 50, you almost need 100% on the exam. And so 25 is what you need to get into, what you need for your English score. I did for most university courses, and that there is only 50%. So getting above 10 on either exam, and if you have a look through the exam descriptors, you can see it's actually not that hard of a task. It's very hard to boost your score from, say, 14, 15 to 16, 17, but to get your score up to 10 or 11, all you need to be doing is addressing the prompt, using the perspective, or analyzing three passages. So that's how these scores relate. All right, so preparation. Okay, so what I want everyone to do in this period of time before exams is reread each of the texts that you've chosen to do, and do a bit of research into the context, the history, and the subsequent, what happened after the text. If you're looking at poetry, I want you to do a bit of investigation into the style of writing style of poetry the author may have been using, or ones that are common in that period. I think what's best is for you to practice with different perspectives. Even if you know you're going to be doing a feminist perspective on the exam, give a Marxist one a go. Give a psychoanalytical one a go. Just so you get a bit more nuance, you get a bit more understanding of how everything comes together. Read articles about your text and familiarize yourself more with your text. Annotate it. Look online for more information, more ideas. And also engage in discussion with your peers. Have a Zoom call with your mates and talk about what you think about like this passage, this paragraph. Because hearing other people's ideas in literature, we cannot stress how important that is. All right, so this is what I did to prepare for section A. This is what I did like a couple of days before the exam. What I want people to do is memorize key points about the text. And so I wrote these, these are another piece of paper actually. They're not right there, but like, where are the turning points? What happens? What happens after them? Where does a character grow? Where does a character do something silly? How does the play end? How does poems end? And then compile the evidence and events under themes that link to a perspective. So for example, for a feminist perspective, well, feminist perspective is huge and it encompasses a lot of stuff. We could talk about the loss of agency. We could talk about heteronormativity or that hegemonic male and female. Or we could also talk about like female characters being reduced to mothers or housewives. Like where does this happen? So for me, this is what I did here. I talked about for postmodern, this tension between absolute and seemingly empirical truth. The postmodern perspective like robs an audience of any recourse to the truth, etc., etc. These are different ideas that all come under my perspective that I could use. Develop a phrase on a quote bank. Here's my phrase bank that I like to use. Rockwellian, we're talking about paintings. A dissemination of information, so the spread of information. Acerbic, I really like that word. It's like almost like sour. But I say like acerbic criticism. I just thought was like just a really nice way of saying stuff. It's like quite hard hitting, quite like jarring. And make sure you've got quotes from the text memorized. This is what I had down here. I had quotes from different literary scholars, like Susan Abbottson was one of the people I use, but also stuff like from the actual text. So for me, it's not Christian, but it works. Pain is pain, suffering is a different matter. I put all my hopes in a character. And also write a bit about why. And I just had this phrase bank and this stuff here with me for the first few times I wrote essays, and then I stopped using it. So because I'd familiarized myself with it enough. For section B, yeah, there it is. Okay. I annotated all my poems. I printed out, I photocopied all of the poems that I was studying, and I tried to annotate like this. And this is the first poem I actually read. This is the very first poem I read from the poetry set that I was studying and the very first annotation of it. So I didn't do a very good annotation, but doing an annotation is better than none. So what I'd recommend you doing, if you're doing poems, is thematically categorize them. Categorize all your poems into different themes. So work out which like poems 1, 2, and 7 all talk about like human desire, and the poems like 7, 8, and 9 all talk about the beauty of nature, for example, and work like that, because then you'll be able to familiarize yourself more with these poetic ideas, and then actually if you get them together in the exam, you can much easier link them together. When it comes to bigger texts, memorize key moments such as crises, major changes, and character developments. So the reason why you need to know your text really well is because you want to know, if you get given a passage, you want to know if it happens before or after a particularly big event. Also, I would just develop generalized interpretations. So I would say most of Robert Browning's poetry, I can generally fit it in to talk about like the beauty that lies within imperfection. And I would almost always talk about that in the exam, but I would have I'd start off with that, but my interpretation at the very end of the essay would be vastly different every single time. I'd also recommend practicing like you are in the exam. Get out three, pick out like three numbers from a hat is what I would do. I'd do like a random number generator 3 times, and I'd get the numbers of 3 different poems, so randomly, and then I'd write an essay about it. If you're doing a book, what I would do is I'd like flip through the book and then pick 3 different spots to write about, and like just do like a page, like choose pick your passages as in they're a page. So like pick like page on like 63 and page 170 and page 300, and then write your passages about those 3 pages. So practice like that and practice handwritten. Right. When it comes to planning, this is what I recommend you do. Spend reading time reading your passages, and then spend at least 5 minutes reading time and the exam. So 10 minutes total to construct a brief plan to follow. Don't bother spelling out everything that you're going to do exactly because you don't have the time. You've got a 2-hour exam. You don't have time to write out every single every single little idea you're going to focus on, which is why practice is so important. The more practice you can do, having like this quite brief plan that you can like touch on, the more prepared you're going to feel for the exam. You can practice planning, and I think Maddie actually touched on this earlier when we were in the Q&A. You can practice planning without writing an exam, and this is where you do your proper, thorough planning. So if let's say you want to study literature, but you're like, I don't have 2 hours to do an exam or 1 hour to do an essay, spend 15 minutes, 20 minutes writing a plan for an essay, for an exam you found online. Plans should include your key points you want to reference, your general interpretations, but yeah, again, don't waste time with explicit detail because that's what we want to be writing about in the essay. Okay, for section A, when it comes to planning, I'm just going to briefly go through this because we're approaching the end of our session today. But section A, do what we did at the start. Deconstruct your prompt and link which key aspects link to your perspective. Develop an overall interpretation that you'd like your perspective to focus on with the prompt as a basis. So work out what you're actually going to talk about. Deconstruct your overall contention into summative parts. So work out what your overall contention is going to be, then work out like the ingredients. Imagine that's a cake, work out what the ingredients are. So work out, let's say your interpretation is about like that no characters are ever going to be happy in the text. Work out like, are you going to talk about individual characters per paragraph? Are you going to talk about individual themes or individual moments in the text? And those are acting as your body paragraph. So work out if you want to talk about themes or moments or characters or whatever. So do that before you actually start writing. Also, I had a terrible habit of forgetting. I've got an awful memory. And I would forget everything an hour after I memorized it. So what I did when I went into the exam, I did section A first. Before the exam, I memorized all the quotes I wanted to know. And then as soon as I got into the exam, as soon as writing time started, I wrote them all down. So if there's really important stuff you want to mention, and especially when you're so nervous sitting in the exam, make sure you write it down. The important stuff, write down, but don't waste your time writing down in your plan, the little itty bitty stuff that you may or may not touch on. For section B, your passage analysis. Highlight your passages, but don't waste time annotating unless you need to. This is why annotating is so important in practice. If you just want to study, you don't want to write an essay, annotate. If you can recognize your passages well enough that you can highlight what you want to talk about, you're going to have so much time to actually write and go back and say, okay, I want to talk about this and that if you get lost. Then if you waste 20 minutes annotating everything and then only have 40 minutes to write an essay. Focus on similarities and differences between passages. Focus on is the tone the same between passages 1 and 2, or is the tone different? Is the themes they've addressed? Are the techniques they've used? Is the message different? And I'd use that to kickstart my analysis. I'd talk about the rhyme scheme between 1 and 2, and then I'd to kickstart my analysis, and then I'd just talk about 2 and the themes in 2. Then I'd link the themes in 2 to passage number 3, for example. And spend time thinking about how the 3 passages contribute to the meaning of the text individually and altogether. What does this passage tell us by itself? And what does this passage tell us in the context of the other passages we've been given? All right, so I had some practice here. For free, you can take a picture of this, and you also there's going to be a recording that you can sign up for. And this is just a couple of section A, section B prompts that you can use if you need extra practice. But again, all of this stuff is available online. Go to the VCE Examiner's Report. All right, so we have study tips and question time. This is not working. Okay, just before we do that, I'm just going to put through into the chat a quick link to evaluation. We'd really appreciate if everybody could fill this one out. So I'm just going to send this to everyone. That's just there. SurveyMonkey, and essentially just fill out what a session you've done, and what you think about it. And in the meantime, I'm just happy to do that question answer thing again. Any questions from today in total, any questions that you want me to, or anything you want Maddie or I to readdress would be absolutely fantastic. Awesome. So how do you access the recording? So, to my understanding, the recording will be, I think you have to, with that SurveyMonkey thing, when you sign up for it, you have to, there's an option to check it on there, on that survey thing. And then you should get access to it. If not, all you need to do is email Skyline Education, who's running the lectures, and then they can work that out for you. Oh, it's my background image reversed. That's very awkward. Oh, whoops. Okay. Okay. Anyhow, is it a good idea to reference scholars discussing text and essay with quotes? Okay. Personally, I reckon it's a good idea to read them. Is it a good idea to reference them? I don't know. That's something like. On one hand, there's some really good ideas, and you really shows you know your text. On the other hand, it can kind of seem unoriginal if you just reference other people's ideas, if that makes sense. So I think it's up to you, really. Personally, I didn't. That wasn't my writing style. But if you think that it's going to help your exam and help your text, you do it. I really recommend experimenting. Try both, see which one you prefer. Because again, literature is such an abstract topic that, what am I saying? It's such an abstract topic that, like, not everything's going to work for everybody.
Sometimes I used to read critical readings, and my English teacher, she told me that I could quote and see what their perspective was, and then it would sometimes I disagree with that perspective and then explain why through analyzing the language. And I think that was an interesting approach to take in an essay.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. The theory, and then in brackets at the end of their quote, you'd write the name of the theorist, or you just say Jane something said this, etc.
100%.
This idea, or which is contrary to my idea.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was a very good point. Thank you, Maddie. Yeah, definitely. Like addressing, if you're going to address anything, make sure you're not just quoting something and saying, yeah, that's what's my point. You're actually critically analyzing what you're saying. Now, this question, do you know anything about golden threads that should be referenced throughout our question analysis essay? Now, obviously, different schools have different terminology. What exactly do you mean by golden threads? Feel free to just type in chat or private message, one of the two of us. Oh, okay. So in this sense, I think the golden threads that they're talking about on that post you found is the themes. So in close analysis, yeah, again, you want to be referencing themes the entire time. And for example, let's say your interpretation is about, let's say there's a common theme between all three of the passages. Well, that's what you want to be kind of basing your analysis off. You don't want to be jumping into a random analysis of random language that doesn't really have any effect to help your interpretation. So essentially, when you have your idea of what you want to interpret, make sure, and how I'd always do it is I'd have my basic idea and I'd try to come up with an end idea. And it's almost like a, it's like you're on a bank of a river. There's your starting point is one bank and the ending point is another bank. And to get across, you've got to jump across on different stones, and the stones aren't necessarily going to be in a straight path. So especially when you're writing an essay, writing about the random stuff that's got nothing to do with the themes you want to discuss or nothing to do with the language that really links in any way is kind of like jumping off into the river and then trying to swim back to those stones. That's a really dumb analogy, I know, but I think that's just that's just how I would think of it. If that, I don't know if that answers your question properly or not, but yes. Okay. First section, next slide for exam tips. I'm missing it. I'll just get it up, see what I was saying. Oh, okay. I will. Can you guys see my screen? Can you guys see the PowerPoint?
Oh, I can't see the PowerPoint.
No. Okay. Yeah, that's all right. I'll stop sharing. I'll reshare. Yeah. Okay. So for section A, so deconstruct your prompt to identify what key aspects link to your perspective. develop an overall interpretation of what you'd like to focus on, and with the prompt as a basis, and deconstruct your overall contention to summative parts. Jot down key quotes and references. That's how I would do it. Now we'll answer that last question. I'm just stop sharing again. But otherwise, please make sure you filled out that survey that I've sent through into the chat. That's really important. And the last question was just any tips for a relatively long text that's hundreds of pages? Yes. Read online. Read your text again, but read other people's opinions online, other literary scholars' opinions online. That is the most important thing if your text is really long. Okay, so make sure, please, that you filled out that thing I sent you, the survey, and please make sure you've done that. But otherwise, thank you very much for your attendance today. I've really appreciated everyone chipping in and participating. Matt and I can stick around for a bit if anyone has any other questions, but thank you. Feel free to head off to lunch.